Joining us. Opportunity to hear from some of Arizona's most influential leaders working in the criminal justice space. They'll be discussing policy issues and potential solutions that are just to protect our community. But first, we have to really thank our sponsors who helped put this event on: Woodrow Technologies, Chandler Gilbert Community College, Arizona Valley Consulting, DW Consulting Group, Arizona Law Enforcement Outreach and Support, Attorneys for Freedom Law and Firm, Legacy Lending USA, and Maduro's Fine Cigars. Can we get a round of applause for our speakers, please? Okay, now I'd like to welcome Chandler Gilbert Community College President, Dr. Greg Peterson, to the podium.
Good morning. Welcome to campus. We are so happy to have you this morning. When we think about the community in our title, it's this. It's bringing these conversations together. It's hearing the vast perspectives and coming forward with solutions. Public safety, criminal justice is core to our mission. We are so honored to have you here. We're so proud of the work that we do with our Law Enforcement Training Academy here at Chandler Gilbert, and that I can announce that one of our first bachelor's degrees that we'll be offering at the Maricopa Community Colleges in fall 2023 will be in public safety administration. So we're committed to this pipeline. We're so excited to hear the solutions that come out of this group that will drive the work we move forward. And we're excited to continue to support. So thank you for letting us be a part of this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson. Appreciate your support of the chamber. Chandler Gilbert Community College is a great college and a great part of our East Valley. I was laughing because former Mayor John Lewis was talking about asking Mayor Harkey to change the name. Sorry, John, it's still going to be Chandler Gilbert Community College. I want to acknowledge that we have a lot of dignitaries here in the room. Rather than me going around the room and introducing a whole bunch of people, we'll be here till noon. If everybody who's not on a panel, who's an elected official, former elected official, if you can just stand and be recognized, it'd be great. Thank you very much. We've got a short video. Terry Kimball, our CEO and president, is unable to be here today. She's actually helping move her aunt down to Phoenix. So we've got a video, and DJ, if you want to go ahead and tee it up, it'd be great.
President and CEO here at the Chandler Chamber, and we are so proud to bring you today's program. I want to thank our speakers and dignitaries here in attendance today. Criminal justice reform impacts both our macroeconomic environment as well as our workforce pipelines, and is closely tied with our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, all of which are issues at the Chandler Chamber, and we care about our business community. Our mission here at the Chandler Chamber.
Well, Terry sends your wishes, I guess. Anyway, it's my pleasure now to introduce the CEO of Woodrow Technologies, Russ Woodrow. I don't do so well without a script, so thank you, Brian, for helping write it. I'm actually Russ Wood, founder of Woodrow Technology Solutions. Woodrow was actually the name of my mother's business back in the 80s, and I just kept the name going. We're a comprehensive tech firm with the goal of redefining expectations across our industry. We focus on the total solution for our clients. We avoid the frustrating and all too common finger pointing that slows down business. The buck always stops at Woodrow. From ground up construction to physical and cybersecurity, network management, and all the other fun things that we do in IT, Woodrow's there for you. Like many other employers these days, I know the struggle of finding employees. Criminal justice reform is an important step to replenishing our workforce pipelines. Hundreds of thousands of young, nonviolent drug offenders pack our prisons with folks who need treatment and opportunity. Jobs that can give stability, identity, self-worth, and opportunity for forward social advancement. At Woodrow, we proudly work with ex-offenders to provide second opportunities, offering the opportunity to succeed, not just a handout. Thank you for being here today. And again, I'm Russ Wood with Woodrow Technologies.
Makita Stewart with Woodrow Technologies, the senior project manager. I've been in this field for over 20 years. Being a female in this field, there are a lot of obstacles. Just having to prove yourself 10 times harder. The way I was raised is you never give up. You got to keep pushing. Let your work speak for itself. With Woodrow Technology, Russ is a great support system. He pushes us to be a better employee daily. He gives us the tools we need to succeed, and he's given me an opportunity to show my skill, grow. I never had a better employee than Russ.
Okay, now I'm pleased to introduce today's event moderator, Dr. Bill Crawford. Dr. Crawford is a longtime public servant and Arizona resident. He and his wife, Diana, have been residing in Chandler since 1998. Bill and I have worked together on a lot of different projects over the years, and I consider him a really good friend. Dr. Crawford was employed by the Maricopa County Community College District for 24 years, retired in 2017 as the vice president of Chandler Gilbert Community College. Before the Maricopa Community College District, he had a distinguished career with the Phoenix Police Department for 23 years and served another 10 years as a volunteer reserve officer. Dr. Crawford is actively engaged in serving the citizens of Chandler as the chair of the Chandler Merit Board and as a member of the Chandler Police and Fire Pension Boards. Additionally, he serves as co-chair of the Chamber's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Please welcome Dr. Bill Crawford.
Good morning. Oh, come on now. I know I saw some people out there. Good morning. Good morning. All right, that's better. That's better. Thank you so much for being here today. Are you ready for an exciting day?
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Are you ready for an exciting day?
Yeah.
That's because that's what we're going to have. We're going to have an exciting day. It's going to be filled with just stimulating conversation. We're going to engage you, and we're going to get kicked off with these 4 individuals that are seated to my right. We'll be hearing from 3 panels today. In our first panel, we will engage the conversation about the private prison industry. Our second session will be about extrajudicial punishment. And in our final panel, we will discuss police reform. Each panel member will share a 5-minute presentation on their specific topic. Following the speaker presentation in each of the topic areas, then I've got some scripted questions that I'm going to pose to them. And then time permitting, we're going to reach out to you, the audience members, to see if you have any questions you would like to pose to our esteemed panel members. Does that work for you?
Yeah.
Wait a minute, I lost you again. Does that work for you? All right, wonderful. So we'll go ahead and get started. In the interest of time, you will find their bios for you in the speakers, bios of the speakers in the program. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. I'm excited to introduce our first panel members to you. State Representative Ben Toma. Oh, by the way, I'm going to ask you to hold your applause until the very end, and then we will give them all applause at the same time. Good? All right, let me start again. State Representative Ben Toma was appointed to represent the residents of Legislative District 22, and Representative Toma, I think that's now 27, correct? All right, in 2017. He was elected to the 54th legislature in 2018, and then again in 2020. He is strongly committed to lowering taxes, protecting property rights, and improving public safety. He serves as a majority leader of the Arizona House of Representatives. Dr. Andrea Montez is an assistant professor with the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. At Arizona State University. How many folks out there? Okay. Do you have any U of A folks out there? Oh, okay. Any Northern Arizona University folks out there? Any Maricopa Community College District people out there? I think I've covered them all. All right. She received her doctorate from Florida State University's College of Criminology and Criminal Justice. She employs both quantitative and qualitative methods to investigate questions related to theories of crime and punishment, crime prevention and school safety, and the privatization of corrections. Mr. John Dacey serves as the executive director of Abolish Private Prisons. Mr. Dacey has been in private practice in Phoenix for almost 30 years and has served as a federal court-appointed mediator. And our final panelist for this morning is Mr. Jaime Malero, who is a founding partner of Malero Alvarez, a government relations and public affairs firm based in Phoenix. He is a former superintendent of public instruction and is viewed as a leader in education and business policy development. Okay, so each of our panelists will now present a 5-minute presentation, and Mr. Malero has agreed to kick us off. Mr. Malero.
Good morning. Good morning, Dr. Crawford. Thank you very much, and thank all of you for having us up here today. It's indeed a pleasure. If it looks like I have a big smile on my face, it's not only because I'm happy to be here with all of you. It's because last time my daughter called me. My daughter's graduating from Thunderbird Graduate School, and she just got a job as an investment banking analyst in London. So I'm very proud. I do appreciate having an opportunity to come and talk with you all. I am, as Dr. Crawford said, a former state school superintendent, founder and partner of Malero Alvarez. But I've also been involved in Arizona. I'm actually born and raised Arizonan, born and raised in Nogales. And I've been here all my life, went to Arizona State University. And I just am a big believer in trying to develop sound public policy. And I've been very fortunate to be engaged in a lot of different issues that have, in my opinion, been a benefit to Arizona. Over the last 25 years, I've seen a lot of efforts that have been, in my opinion, transforming. And a lot of it has been because of the issue of privatization that has allowed us to do that. And I know we're going to talk a lot about the need for prison reform and need for justice reform, which is absolutely real. But you have to understand there's been a lot of rhetoric that I think has not led us to really talk about the things that have to get done. And I recall when Access was started. Access is the state Medicaid system in the mid-'80s. There was a lot of the same rhetoric around what happened there because it was basically using private companies to provide healthcare to people on Medicaid. And at the time, I was talking to Joe Anderson, who was one of the architects of the Medicaid system. And he reminded me that he was criticized because he was being told that, well, what's going to happen is that the insurance companies are going to incentivize people to get sick so they can actually get paid more. The same thing happened with charter schools in the state. And I was very much involved in the whole engagement in getting educational systems and settings that match students and families' needs. And I'm very proud of how we were able to do that. But at the time, you know, and it's still a lot of that rhetoric we hear today, is that, well, you're taking away money from the public system and you're giving it to privates. And I always have viewed it as, well, you're putting money behind children that meets their educational needs and meets their parents' and families' needs. And in both of those settings, in the healthcare setting and in the education setting, the thing that's transformative, which is also the case with private prisons, is that there has to be transparency and accountability within the system, because if it does not work, it must be shut down and it must be held accountable. And that's where I think we've seen progress. Our access system has been touted as one of the models in the country. It's regarded as the gold standard. Republicans and Democrats across the country have emulated what we've done because of this model. How you develop a system that uses, yes, private companies to do it, but you regulate it. And you make sure that the structures in place are making sure that the activities that are serving the public is met. And that's what I hope this conversation is about, because I would love to have this discussion continue, because we really do need to improve and make sure that Arizona's systems are effective. And the last thing I'll tell you is some of the hyperbole that has gone on about private prisons. I remember back when, as you recall, the infamous 1070 was passed in Arizona. And it was National Public Radio did a story which was picked up by the New York Times, Washington Post, all of the national outlets. And the story was that, well, this was drafted and the architects behind 1070 was the private prison industry. And specifically it was a company now that I represent, Core Civic. At the time it was Corrections Corporation of America. Because the argument was, well, they're going to get a lot more people put in the prisons and then the private prison industry is going to benefit from that. Well, what they didn't say and what they later corrected, took about 6 months later, was that I was the lead lobbyist for Core Civic at the time, Corrections Corporation of America. And I had actually lobbied then Governor Jan Brewer to not sign 1070. And there was documentation about me going up to the governor's office and making that case. There was also an event, it was the Arizona Hispanic Chamber where my firm was awarded that year. And Governor Brewer was there, and it was before she signed it. And I made the case to over 1,000 people that we needed to back the governor on why that legislation was not needed. So it was ironic that this narrative came out and this hyperbole came out without facts. But that's been the problem a lot of times in Arizona policy and politics, is that it's more rhetoric than facts. And I'm hoping that discussions like this can help us to get out the facts and make sure that at the end of the day, we have good public policy. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bolero. Okay, our second speaker this morning is Mr. John Dacey.
Thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm a Phoenix lawyer. I've been practicing here for more than 40 years. I was a lobbyist for 20 years, and that included representing the Catholic hospitals in Southern Arizona at the Arizona legislature. So I'm somewhat familiar with the institutional model of providing services. And one thing I know about the institutional model, if the beds are empty, the model fails. And so there is a financial incentive to get paid more for the services and make sure you don't have bad debt and to keep the beds full. So what I'd love to be able to do if we had enough time would be to actually have a hypothetical private prison corporation shareholder meeting where our job here today is to come up with ideas for our strategic plan for the next 5 years and determine what it is we think we should be doing in order to get into more markets, to sell more kinds of products, to sell more of our core product, to change legislation that calls for tougher sentencing and criminalizing more behaviors and squashing alternatives to incarceration and spending money on lobbyists and on campaign contributions to make sure that the friends of the industry are in positions of power, which is why the private prison industry was very influential in creating truth in sentencing, 3 strikes and you're out, and mandatory minimum sentences at the federal level, trickling down to the states. And oh, by the way, since 1980, the United States has become a country of mass incarceration. We didn't used to be a country of mass incarceration. Our curve in terms of the numbers and rates of people we incarcerated from 1920 to 1980 was fairly even. But in 1980, because of changes in policy, not changes in crime, we decided to throw more people in prisons and jails in this country than Russia and China, multiple times the rate of any Western European country and Canada. So it's a matter of change in policy. The industry is very powerful here. There are 12 private prisons in Arizona. They're all for profit. 2 of the companies are publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. And when the US Department of Justice issued a report in 2016 on the performance of their private contractors, talking about how poor their performance was, many more incidents, much more violence, They decided we're no longer going to contract with them at the federal level. What happened? Their stock values tumbled. And then we had an election 3 months later that changed the administration in Washington that said we're going to not only use private prisons, we're going to use them a lot more. Their stock value shot up. What is behind the stock value? It is projections of people in prison and immigration detention. It is the stock value of these corporations that is based on incarceration of human beings, incarcerating a couple of million people. And of course, they're not all in private prisons. Most of them are not. Although we do have 12 here, 6 under contract with the state. City of Mesa contracts. Does Chandler? I don't know if they piggyback on Mesa's contract. The feds have contracts here in Arizona. And oh, by the way, we import prisoners from other states to Arizona. You can imagine how many visitors Hawaiian prisoners get in Arizona and how connected they are to the communities they're going to go back to, because most people in prison are going back to their communities. I think incarcerating people for profit, incarcerating the many for the profit of the few is slavery, not like these contracts are sold off at public auction based on projections of number of people in the facilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dacey. The third speaker this morning is Dr. Andrea Montes.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me. I was asked to be here today in part because I did my dissertation on the privatization of corrections, and I have published several studies since that time. I think one of the first important things that provides context for this discussion is we frequently talk about private and public prisons as these distinct institutions, but the truth is that privatization exists in many of our public prisons as well. Public institutions have private healthcare, private substance abuse treatment, private education classes. So when we talk about private or public, we're really talking about the correctional officers and the warden, but there really is a spectrum of privatization. People who are incarcerated in our public prisons are still exposed to the private prison industry in other ways. Also, many people are transferred to different facilities, so they maybe have a mix in the time they're serving their term of incarceration, where they're experiencing both public and private incarceration. I think that, and there are two sort of umbrella conversations, I think, that are important here. One is part of the conversation that's been brought up. Does just having private prisons contribute to mass incarceration? Does it contribute to harms and to unnecessary incarceration of individuals? The second part of the conversation has to do with how they even implement their supervision and their services. So how does the quality of private care and supervision compare to the quality to what our public prisons provide? This is where sort of, from my angle, the sort of evidence sort of lies in this arena. And most of the research suggests that there's really a mix where private prisons and public prisons are better on one area, but not on the other, and vice versa. And then the other common argument we hear is, well, we need to privatize prisons because they save taxpayer dollars. This is where most of the research exists. And there's really not clear evidence that that's the case. There's not clear evidence that privatizing prisons saves a lot of money for taxpayers. And so this is an important conversation to have, right? We want the folks, if we are using prisons The point is what? Punishment, improve public safety, reduce likelihood of engaging in crime, improved well-being, all sorts of other outcomes that we're interested in, right? Those are, I think, some of the main ones. Improved perceptions of justice for people who are victimized. So totally, we should be debating public and private prisons. This is a focus that we should have. I spent a lot of my career on that, so I believe that. But I also don't believe we should be having that conversation at the expense of understanding where our prison system is, public or private. Because the implication, you know, if people always want to ask me, okay, well, should we have private prisons then? And I think that's, again, a fair question. But the implication of that is, I say no, is that we should be using public prisons. And the way the public prisons currently operate, we know that they also don't achieve any of those things. They also don't make victims feel like the justice system was fair. They also don't improve public safety. They also don't reduce recidivism. So I'm not saying that to say we shouldn't have prisons. I'm saying that to say that the way prisons operate, public and private, are not operating in the way that we want our prisons, or that we think that our prisons operate, or that they should operate. So again, I look forward to the conversation about public and private, but we should be talking about prisons, period, as well.
Thank you, Dr. Montes. Our final speaker for the private prison industry session this morning is the Majority Leader, Representative Ben Toma.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the invite. I was talking to Joe, who lives in my neighborhood, in my district, that it's a little bit of a haul from North Peoria to get here at 8 o'clock in the morning, but happy to be part of it. I have to first admit that I don't have any background, really, of note in the criminal justice space. I don't have, thankfully. I've never been involved myself, and I don't have anybody in my family that's been involved either, or close friends. And so when I came to the legislature, I sort of accidentally ended up there, long story, but I came in without an agenda, is the point. And so I came in to learn and to try to be as effective as I could representing my district. So in that sense, I guess I'm an idealist. One of the first subjects that I got interested in is this idea of criminal justice. Not because, again, I have any personal experience with it, but because I was interested just in the idea of justice overall. I have to admit, I'm a philosophy major, so fair warning. But I was interested in this idea at all, and it seemed to me that there is something wrong, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what it is. I found out pretty quickly that that rhetoric, I think that was mentioned, I forget by who before, hasn't been helpful from my perspective. Again, keep in mind, I'm ignorant of this, and I did not have a particular agenda when walking into it. But I found that the rhetoric is just wasn't being helpful to actually moving any sort of conversations forward in any substantive way on what to do to fix things. I also found out that no one can agree on what the right data is. I think, Dr. We've spoken to this before in a different context. And that's also a problem, because if you can't agree on what the measurement is, then you can't agree on what you should do to try to move that needle one way or the other. And so my focus has been, and I'll get to private prisons in a second, but my focus has been to try to address those issues that I think are sort of common sense. Again, from an ignorant perhaps perspective, or for a simplistic understanding of how the system works. I've also been highly supportive of law enforcement. And I am a supporter of the rule of law. A little bit that wasn't mentioned about me. I'm an immigrant from Eastern Europe. I was born there when mandatory minimums came to Arizona. I was not born. And when they came to the federal government, I was 2. So, and not in this country. So again, not a lot of background in that space either. But the one size fits all also didn't quite resonate with me either in every circumstance. So, of course, the problem is you allow too much flexibility and then people abuse it. And we've seen situations of that so much in Arizona, but in other states where murderers and rapists got out with almost nothing but a slap on the wrist, and they went and did what they did before, which is completely unacceptable from a policy standpoint, especially for those of us that have to make those decisions, have to write those bills, have to vote on those bills. It's a horrible thing to think about, that I could have passed some bill that allowed someone to get out and then hurt someone's family member or kill someone or rape someone. I mean, it's just awful. We can't allow that to happen. And so where does that leave us? It's complicated, is what I've learned, in short. Very complicated, and lots of nuance. And again, I'm not interested in rhetoric. So when people throw out terms that have kind of political or have been politicized to the point where they automatically speak to the base of whoever it is they're speaking to, but they don't move the conversation forward, they sort of shut down the other side. So when we demonize, and I'm not trying to pick a fight with anybody, but when we demonize corporations because they're big and bad, that doesn't help those of us on the other side that are trying to figure out, is this contract for said private prison contract a good one or not? Are they doing a good job? Are they providing the resources necessary for the inmates to be able to better themselves, to better the situation, to come out better than they went in, so that they are able to get a job and sort of reintegrate into society? Anyway, I get lots to talk about there, but the one other point that Dr. brought up that I wanted to make sure that we mention is one of the other things we do at the legislature every year, as much as we might want to avoid it, is the budget. And in the budget process, there's this big conversation always about considering that there's major issues with staffing, by the way, for all businesses now, but especially for corrections. DOC always comes and says we need more money for staffing, and we're probably going to do again this year, more money for staffing. But there's parity too. So when we do that, the private prisons say, well, we need more money for staffing as well, because they compete with each other to some extent to get staff, and they compete with all of you, all of us, to get employees. And it's really hard, and it's not, again, maybe ignorant, but I can't imagine enjoying that sort of job myself. So I would expect that that it's hard to get employees. And the problem is, like everything else in life, we can be as great as we can, or we can try to do as great a job as we can to create systems that are great. But in the end, those systems are only going to be as good as the people that are there. So it's that people factor that's common to almost everything in life, every sort of service that's provided, that's incredibly important. And so, and at some level you pay, or you get what you pay for. So it's important that we fund whatever we do, that we fund all the services that we provide at a level that's adequate. And I don't think it is at this point for the correctional industry. So I think that's important. I look forward to having the conversation more. I look forward to the debate, and it looks like it's a friendly one, so that's always nice. But again, I just want to make sure that, at least from my perspective, that I just make it clear that I'm not interested in politicized statements and politicized phrases, because they just, in my experience, have not moved, not just in this context, but in any context down at the legislature. It just pushes people into a corner, it doesn't bring them together to try to figure out how do we move forward and how do we get something that we can all agree on. So thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll transition into our question and answer part of this presentation. So the first question is, jails, state prisons, and federal prisons are generally staffed by public employees and paid for through local, state, and federal tax revenues. Private correctional facilities are for-profit, and they may house local, state, and federal offenders. What public purpose is served by having private correctional facilities, and what are the advantages and/or disadvantages for these types of correctional institutions? Mr. Malera, could I ask for your perspective on that particular question?
Well, I would say that it's fairly simple. I mean, what the state is needing as far as making sure that prisoners are put into settings that will help them rehabilitate, that they become productive citizens as quickly as possible. Because that's what we want to do, right? Not only do we want to make sure that they don't come back into prison. We want to make sure that they're actually productive citizens, that they're contributing to our society. And so the programs that have to be a part of this, whether they're faith-based programs, educational programs, need to be tailored in a way that are effective. And that has to be included in the argument that I make with the privatization is that they're structured in a way that I think they can be much more effective in that regard. So to give you an example, when Florence, with a lot, as Mr. Toma knows, there was a lot of debate over the last couple of years about the problems in Florence. I mean, little things like the locks didn't work. So that's a little bit of a problem, I think, in the prison. And they were, a lot of the prisoners were housed in temporary beds, basically bunk beds. And for minimum security prisons, those are dangerous. It's dangerous not just to the prisoners, but it's dangerous to the guards. So being able to then transition now in what's basically built to the state needs, La Paloma was built basically to make sure that not only you have security and the prisoners and the guards are in situations where they're safer, but the programs that are needed are going to be offered in a way that, again, makes them ultimately productive citizens. And that's what the accountability is that has to be talked about. I think Dr. Montes is absolutely right. That's where the debate should be. That's where the scrutiny, the oversight and people looking at what needs to happen. But this hyperbole that this is akin to slavery, I'm sorry, that's just unbelievable. I mean, that is the rhetoric that doesn't advance what we need to have happen. And I would hope this discussion is about how do we continue to move public policy forward in a way that benefits our state and not that benefits certain segments and organizations that benefit them.
Thank you. Mr. Dacey, your perspective, advantages, disadvantages, do you see any?
Sure. Are you hearing me? Okay. Yeah, there are several things, but first of all, Mr. Malera, please understand, I'm not talking about rhetoric when I refer to mass incarceration and profiteering off of taking away people's liberties in a rhetorical realm. I'm talking about it very much in terms of our country's actual history. Slavery didn't end with the 13th Amendment. It turned into the Black Codes, which criminalized Black life after the Civil War, and it turned into convict leasing, which wound up reincarcerating not just many of the freed slaves, but their children, and peonage contracts, by which private interests could pay off the court fees of people in the criminal justice system, and then they would have to be their servants for many years, if not for life. Our criminal justice system has been very complicit, especially in the detention and incarceration of people of color. That's a fact. So how I come at this question from a policy perspective is this. Yes, we could look at privatizing prisons like any other successful public-private partnership. And to be certain, my background is in healthcare and the Access program. I'm quite familiar with how successful those relationships can be. The question is, when you're talking about taking away people's life, their liberty, and you're authorizing private actors to use force, including deadly force, is it a good idea? And does the Constitution even permit it? I wonder if I turned over that question to members of the public police departments. How many of the functions you perform daily do you think should be turned over to private security companies? How much might the taxpayers save if instead of paying you a public salary with public benefits, we turn it over to private security companies, as some colleges have done, as some small towns have considered? What about prosecutors? Should we privatize by hiring private firms instead of people who are dedicated to public service first? Judges, you want to hire private judges? Are there some things only government should do? We don't want to turn, I don't think we want to turn over our public elections to be run by private interests. It troubles me greatly that we've turned over so much of our national defense to private interests. But what can go wrong if we privatize the taking away of liberty, which is so different than charter schools or Medicaid or building roads? Taking away a person's liberty is a very different animal. So what can go wrong if we make it a profit-making venture instead of seeing mass incarceration as a societal ill that costs the taxpayers dearly, as well as the impact it has on families and individuals? Well, here's an example. Did you know that our retirement plans for our state legislators, state judges, state prosecutors, state police are all invested in private prison corporations and other industries that thrive on mass incarceration? I'll bet most of the individuals who are covered by those plans have no idea. And it wouldn't affect how they do their job if they did. But if you're a defendant sitting in a courtroom and you know that the prosecutor, the police witness, the public defender, and the judge are all invested through their pension plans in industries thriving on mass incarceration, how do you feel about the justice system and what kind of shake you're going to get?
Dr. Montes, you've done a lot of research in this area. You mentioned earlier that your dissertation was in this area. I believe that's what you said. Can you help us understand, what does the data say to us about private prisons? Are there advantages? Are there disadvantages? What should the people in this room understand about private prisons?
Yeah, so if we think about when private prisons or contemporary private prisons, because we had private prisons way back when, but contemporary private prisons sort of came on the market in the 80s and 90s. The need that they served at that time was the fact that we had sentencing laws being implemented that were incarcerating people at a rate that we've never seen before, and our public institutions literally didn't have enough prison beds for these individuals, and they couldn't build prisons fast enough. So what did they do? They partnered with private industry to build those prisons. Now that was 30 or 40 years ago. If that needs, our jurisdictions, our governments clearly think there's still a need for private prisons. We continue to see them partner and contract with private prisons. They must do that because they feel there's a need. Does that need still exist? Unfortunately, we don't know. When we talk about where's money being invested, when we talk about what's the right data, research data is not really a very sexy thing to invest in when we're thinking about our budget. But I guarantee you every big major company invests in research. And so if we want answers to these questions, that's part of what we have to invest in. We have to invest in understanding this, how do public and private prisons compare? We have to do that to hold people accountable. You know, I talk to a lot of folks who work in prisons, who work in juvenile detention centers, and some of the things they describe as how they're monitored is like an audit sheet. I remember talking to someone, this was in a juvenile detention center, but the way that they monitored that facility is they went in and they looked like, are there enough forks in the cafeteria? Do they have enough pills in the infirmary? These things are important. I'm not saying they're not important, but it doesn't tell us anything about how people are being treated, what their ties are to their family, how they're going to do fare when they get out, how they're being educated. So it's a little bit self-interest. I use data in my work, but I do believe if we want to hold prisons, public and private, accountable, if we want to know who is treating individuals better, who is doing a better job at preparing people to reintegrate and letting people maintain ties with their family and all of these things that we say are important, we have to invest in that. I do think I study private prisons, but one of the things, if we decide as a society we want to get rid of private prisons, I think that the fastest route to that is sentencing reform. It's not getting rid of private prisons per se, but it's decreasing the demand. If we're not incarcerating as many people, if we are changing our sentencing policies so that there is less demand, we will no longer need private prisons. And we will be able to reduce the number of people in our public prisons. And hopefully, we get out of this age of mass incarceration that we are currently in.
Thank you, Doctor. Representative Toma, there has been some conversation about the budget. And I believe you're very involved in those conversations. So could you talk to us about what kinds of things are in the backs of minds of legislators as they make decisions about private prisons and budget?
Ooh, there's a loaded question. What goes through the mind of legislators when they're talking about the budget? I wish I could answer that in totality. I wish I knew in totality, because it would make the whole process a whole lot faster and easier. But I do want to touch on a couple of things which are important. So the budget is, there's always, it's essentially a fight for a piece of the pie for each individual legislator, for each individual subject or initiative that's on there. So it really is, the issues have to be important in order to make it through and to get funding. But going back just a little bit, I wanted to just point out that as I understand it, the point of the criminal justice system in general is it kind of has 2 points, right? There's the punitive part of it. You did something wrong, we don't like it. There's a punishment that goes along with that, and then there's the desire to rehabilitate, as been talked before. And so then the idea is if you have to do, since our system is largely one of incarceration for X amount of time, then during that time, what should you be doing in order to come out better than you went in, as I previously said? And that there's a lot of debate about that, but I actually agree, Dr. Montes here, which is that we as legislators can't duck this question. Ultimately, it's up to us as policymakers to decide and to decide what the punishment should be. In other words, what should the sentencing be? And I don't know everything that happened, as I said earlier, in the 1980s. I suspect that it has a lot to do with what was happening in the 60s and the 70s, because in government, as much as we like to think that we're ahead of the curve, we're always responding to things. That's, again, another observation that I've been there. And so, and I assume in the 60s and 70s, and again, this is just me, so if I'm wrong, you can blame me. There were lots of things were happening, including kind of drug culture, and there's a lot in terms of sentencing discussions that we've had, that a lot of crimes are motivated by addictions. And the thing is, people that are addicted are not thinking straight. They're not thinking about, often they're not thinking about what the consequences of their actions are if they're addicted. And so presumably that's how we ended up with it. At least I think that's a factor. I'm actually 100% on board with the idea of us taking a really hard look at our sentencing structure and our sentencing codes to see if they do in fact match, if they're the right thing to do. And that's a big project. I will point out though, I have been successful to some extent in pushing through criminal justice reforms, more so than maybe some of my other colleagues in the short time that I've been there. And in both cases, in case of Hannah Pryor's was one, I don't know, maybe we're getting into the weeds a little too much, but it has to do with sentencing and length of sentencing, and also in record sealing and giving ex-felons a true second chance after the fact. And in both of those cases, which are very big bills, long fights, multiple years to get them across the finish line, the private prison contract or the private prison lobbyists were not involved at all. They were very neutral on it. And by the way, if you guys think that they did it behind the scenes, let me tell you something about the legislature. There are no secrets there. As much as people want to pretend that there aren't. If you start working against someone else, they will find out and they'll come get you. It's just how it is. So I can tell you, at least in the context of what I've been involved with in terms of reducing the length of sentencing and making it easier for people to reintegrate, and therefore making it easier for people to avoid recidivism. Yeah. The private contractors have not been against it. Final point about Mr. Dacey's point about the investments in their PSPRS and ASRS those systems are invested in so many things that I don't like, that including lots of companies that are into things like ESG, kind of woke investing, all those other things that are out there. They're very, very big systems. I don't know, and he's right, I don't know to what extent they're invested in private prisons, but it's never been a factor to me as a policymaker what those systems are involved in. So maybe it is to some people, but I got to tell you from one policymaker's idea, at least, it really hasn't been effective.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's move on to our second question now. Our second question. The United States leads the world in the rate of citizen incarceration. No other country houses more persons per capita than does the United States. This has resulted in recent efforts to reduce the number of individuals in prison through changes in laws to reduce mandatory sentences and provide judges with greater discretion in the length of sentences imposed. Given that private prisons are for profit, how will the efforts to reduce prison costs impact their business model? So, Mr. Malera.
So let's talk about the number of people that are in private prisons right now, nationally. Anybody want to hazard a guess how many people nationally are in the private prison industry? 500,000. So how much percentage of the population of prisoners? 8%. 8% are in the private prison industry. In Arizona, it's about 22%.
They're going up or down?
I think it's going down. So prison rates, at least in Arizona, have been going down for the last 5 years. So you have 22% that are in Arizona, and that increased significantly just this last year because of the closure of Florence. So we talked about Florence was a dilapidated prison. The inmates within the Florence and the public prisons right now are in an unconstitutional healthcare setting. It's been sued, and they are right now, it still hasn't been fixed yet. So the notion that the private prison industry doesn't want to see the reforms take place is just not true. I think the private prison industry would make the case that if you allow us to do this and allow us to provide these programs and allow us to provide these healthcare settings, which again is also, privatized, then there's an opportunity for us to demonstrate, because there's accountability in the system, that we can do it and do it better. And maybe even have a higher percentage of the prison population. A lot of the reforms that are taking place are really around the minimum security prisoners, which should be put in place. I mean, I think having prisoners in jail for very minor offenses is ridiculous. That has to be reformed. The contracts that we have here are for medium security prisoners. And by the way, I want to say this because it's been talked about people's liberties are being taken away. Their liberties, they gave up their liberties when they victimized and they committed crimes against people in our state and in our country. A judge sentenced them to these prisons because they committed crimes that were against the law. And so they need to be put away. But again, they need to be put away in systems that are humane, they need to be put away in systems that are safe, and they're going to rehabilitate them to become productive citizens. There's no argument there. And that has to be the discussion that we have. And again, and getting away from the silliness that occurs around, while there's people we're investing in retirement systems because, Mr. Toma knows that he's going to benefit from that. So of course he's going to give him more money. Or police officers or judges are thinking that way. That's just absolute silliness.
Mr. Dacey, your perspective on this question.
Sure, this is such a big question. There's a lot to talk about. But I guess if I was a shareholder of the corporation that was an institutional model, I'd wonder where my money was going if we're making campaign donations and hiring lobbyists, but we're not doing anything to influence policy. What are we doing? So all of the people in prisons, I guess what it comes down to for me is perverse incentives. Mass incarceration is a sign of individual failure, potentially community failure. It should certainly be seen as an illness of a community that costs us dearly at the individual and the broader community level. And our criminal justice system ought to be motivated to do something to turn that around. But when we make incarcerating people a for-profit venture, the incentives are turned around 180. And keep in mind that when a person is in a prison, they can get written up. And that can affect when they get out. And if a place is terribly understaffed, such that there are a lot of lockdowns, or you've got staff that are inexperienced, undertrained, high turnover, where you have much more violence or incidents within a facility, you have a tendency toward higher recidivism, more crimes, staying longer, which is why there are some data reports, very limited, that indicate people in private prisons serve more of their sentence in the facility than in the community. So the incentives, in our view, are wrong. And the second thing I would do if I saw the numbers going down, if I was a lobbyist for the prison corporations or a shareholder, I would look to the contracts, which is why Arizona signs contracts with private prison corporations that can be as long as 20 years and give them 90% or higher guaranteed occupancy. So what does that mean? Crime rate goes down, the numbers of people in Arizona in prisons go down. And oh, by the way, we're among the top 5 in the number and percentage of people we incarcerate, and the percentage of our prisoners we put in private prisons. But if those numbers are going down and the beds are emptying in the private prisons, if I'm an elected official, I don't want to have to explain to my taxpayers, voters, why we're paying for empty private prison cells, which means there is an incentive to move more people from the public prisons to the private prisons. That would be part of my strategy, which, by the way, is what Arizona's contracts with private prison corporations require.
Thank you. Dr. Montez, you mentioned, I believe, in your previous response, a sentencing reform. So could you expand on that a little bit? What do we see across the country in this area in regards to sentencing reform? And from your judgment, or in your judgment, how do you see it impacting private prisons?
Yeah, so I'll talk about this in a few different ways. So I'll start by saying, I think criminal justice reform, we have to think about it in short-term solutions and long-term solutions. We have people that are currently incarcerated right now. We need to address the issues that they're experiencing. We have people who've been victimized right now. We need to address the issues they're experiencing. But we also have to recognize that we need reforms. If we implemented sentencing reform right now, whole cloth across, that we're not going to see those effects for 10 years, 20 years down the road. So those are long-term solutions. So in thinking about how sentencing reform is changing the business model of private corporations, the answer is yes, it is. But like any business, what these companies have done is they've just pivoted. They have maybe focused on prisons, but now most of those large companies are also invested in community corrections. They have halfway houses, they have reentry centers. I don't think in Arizona, but in some other states, there's private probation officers. They've pivoted to now, yes, we do still do prisons, but now we're also doing these other community-based corrections. So they've seen the sentencing reform happening, and they are now trying to engage with the new types of sentences that are out there. So this is where I think policymakers have a chance to be sort of at least at the same time, happening at the same time as policy, rather than coming 10 years later, as Representative Toma mentioned. I think that the way we as a country do private prison contracts is not great. We don't really ask for a lot of metrics that are met. So if we are going to say we're going to have private corporations involved in corrections, we need to have contracts that require the metrics that we've been talking about, reduced recidivism, improved victims feel improved perceptions of justice, racial and ethnic disparities have to be addressed. We have all of these things, public safety, all of these things that if we're going to contract with these companies to do, whether it's prison management or it's operating a halfway house or doing probation services, that we have metrics that it's not just you offer the service, you need to offer this service well. You need to offer this service well and in a way that is cost efficient for taxpayers. Because one of the things when we spend, also when we spend money on these things that don't work, not only are we spending money on something that doesn't work and causes harms, we're also diverting, there are things that we know that do work. So we're diverting money away from the things that do work, which means we are not improving public safety. We're creating the future victims when we have policies that don't work, that don't improve public safety. We're harming families of victims. We're harming families of folks that come under correctional supervision. So when we think about how sentencing reform is changing, they're pivoting. They're becoming involved in how these new whatever new punishments these sentences are requiring. So if we're going to continue that trend, we need to have contracts that reflect the metrics and the ideals that we have for our correction system.
Representative Toma, things are changing. Prison cost. How does the state address these changes and these concerns? What should we know about?
Thank you. You're right, things are changing. Costs are changing for everybody on all kinds of, just go buy some gas on the way home. So you're absolutely right, it is changing. But even in spite of all that, or beside, leaving that aside for a moment, I fully agree with Dr. Marches once again, that what we need is good data. And by the way, that doesn't, I don't want us to let our own public system off the hook either. We need good data in the public system as well as in the private system. And then we need to be able to compare them and to see which one is in fact doing better. And if one isn't doing better, if the outcomes are not better in the private side, then we can make those decisions and we can choose to scale back as necessary. But going back to the previous point again, I really do think this is, and I once again agree, this is about sentencing reform first and foremost. If you really want to make a dent in this, sentencing reform is very, very important. I see he snuck in here, but Representative Blackman had a bill having to do with earned release credits. And it's something that I supported and I still support. And I believe actually the private prison, you can correct me, I may if I'm wrong, but I believe that the private prisons actually supported that bill while our department was less enthusiastic about it on the public side. And so that would have just briefly, that would have reduced time, that would have given inmates the ability to get certain skills and to go through certain training and programming and reduce their time further down from the mandatory minimum, which is I think 85%, down to 70. I think he's nodding. So so it would have shortened the amount of time someone is in prison, but it would have required certain things of them, certain programming, certain treatment, and so on. So that's an example where perhaps private prison contractors would maybe kind of work against their own incentive if the incentive is to keep someone there as long as possible. Now, of course, the argument could be made, well, now they're getting paid for programming, but that aside, that is less relevant to me as a policymaker than the actual outcome. That matters to me more. Is once again, is X number of years or months punishment the right thing to do? And if not, then what is the right number? In terms of lots have been said, I think a point was made by Mr. Dacey before about what would we be willing to privatize? Would we be willing to privatize law enforcement or prosecutions or judges? Obviously, that's a complicated issue. I'm not sure that I would be comfortable with privatizing those areas for a number of reasons. One of which is the perception that comes along with it. But again, it's not the private prisons that get to decide. It's not the contractors that get to decide what the length of the term is. That's decided prior to. And it's kind of interesting to me. Final point, and I'll get back to everybody else here. The idea is that once you put mandatory sentences in, that all of a sudden this eliminates subjectivity from the system. That to me, I find a little bit disingenuous. And the reason is there is still subjectivity. There always is subjectivity. It starts with law enforcement. And again, I support you guys. You guys are great. I don't mean that, but it starts with you charging someone, arresting someone and doing what you do, which thank you for what you do, by the way. But the real subjectivity is with the prosecutors as opposed to with the judges. Now, the judges no longer have subjectivity or have a lot less of it, but the prosecutors have a ton of subjectivity in terms of what do they choose to charge someone with. And then they know fairly well what that's going to mean. Once you're charged with this, then you're going to fall, if you're convicted, you're going to fall into this sentencing scheme and you're going to go away for X number of years. And it's usually a pretty long time. So I just don't want us to delude ourselves is the reason I brought that up. It's still subjective. Any system is subjective as long as human beings are involved in it. And human beings are involved in every system. So I know it's kind of stating the obvious, but that's where we are. And that's why I think as policymakers, we can't skirt this issue. We really need to be supportive and actually do a deep dive into whether or not the current structure is the right one in terms of lengths and so on for each sentence.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Toma. Okay, now we have just a few minutes for questions from the audience. So this is your opportunity. If you have a burning question to ask one of our four panelists up here. Okay, I see one person over here. So I'm going to walk over here with my mic so that you can state your question. Would you please address it to a specific panelist?
Okay, let's go with Core Civic. Can we talk about, or can you explain or discuss the occupancy rates in these contracts? So occupancy rates meaning whether your prison is full or not, what is the taxpayer paying you?
So as it was mentioned, there is a 90% occupancy rate requirement. And that stems from the fact that as we staff up these prisons, and we have certain contract agreements that we enter into the state that we're going to offer all these various services. We're going to offer these rehabilitation programs. We're going to make sure that there's the security requirements that the state authorizes us to do. There has to be an ability to say, okay, we can meet those requirements because we can budget for that. But everything, sir, everything is subject to appropriation on a yearly basis. What happened, what wasn't mentioned under that scenario, in California, Core Civic had the same requirements. California went through a massive change, as you all know, probably with justice reform. And there was about 10,000 prisoners that were then freed. Core Civic shut down 2 of its prisons because they didn't have the appropriations for them. So that was what private prisons do. We have to make sure that we're fulfilling the contracts of what the state requires, what lawmakers require, and what they want to see happen. But they're subject to the appropriations and they're subject to what the state wants to do. And I think that's the kind of system, just like I talked about within other fields. Privatization gives us more flexibility, it gives us more accountability, and that should be the focus, is the accountability and making sure that these things are being done and being done well.
If I may.
Go right ahead, Representative Toma.
Yeah, if I may briefly add to that. One of the other interesting things I found out about these contracts, just looking at it again, just purely from a budget standpoint now, not opining on whether or not is the right thing to do, but is that some of these contracts are 20-year contracts, but they're kind of a lease to own type of setup for the state. So what happens in the contract is that, yes, we are guaranteeing, say 90% or whatever the number is, but the private contractor gets the land, they build the facility, they run it for 20 years, and at the end of that, they hand over the keys to the state, and the facility is owned by the state at that point. So it's a way the state uses to fund the actual construction or major rehab of a facility as well. So that's, again, not opining right, wrong. I'm just pointing out that that is one of the reasons that there is a guaranteed rate.
Okay, we have a question all the way in the back over here behind this young lady, and then I'll come to you next, sir.
Thank you. This question is probably for Dr. Montes. When attempting to make a comparison between the success rate or the failure rate between private and state-operated prisons, how do you come up with a formula when we already know that, at least in Arizona, prisoners who are serving a sentence often go between the state prison and the private prison, and they interchange, they spend their time in both facilities. So who gets to claim the success? Who is blamed for the failure?
Well, you hit the nail on the head with that question. It's the primary limitation of being able to compare public and private facilities. If we had better data where we were collecting information more regularly from prisons, we would be able to make those comparisons because we would know exactly what happens in each prison when it happens. But the way data exists now and how it's analyzed is we get a data set that, you know, here's data from the last 5 years. Well, when did that happen or where? And sometimes you're able to get at that. So the way that we try to get at the best is we find two groups of individuals that spent the majority or all their time in public and majority or all their time in private who look similar on, they have a similar prior record, they have you know, a similar history of whether they've been incarcerated, they were incarcerated for a similar offense, they have similar demographics. So we try to create, you know, if you think back to science class, you know, you know, what you would get if you did randomly assign people in an experiment, which we of course don't do. But you try to create two groups that are as like as possible, and then look at the differences among those groups. It's not by any means perfect. If we had better information, if we had better investments in data, we would be able to better look at that and understand how those transfers between facility impacted folks. But creating those two groups is really is how we try, is the most rigorous way we can get at it with how things currently exist.
If I could just add one comment to that. Part of what complicates that is that the private prisons are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act or the public records laws. And they're very successful in beating back proposals in front of Congress to make them subject to the Freedom of Information Act. So part of the problem is even getting the data from the private vendors as opposed to the public corrections agencies.
This is true. I do want to just clarify, though. There are some of the administrative data that prisons have that are this comparable across institutions, or there have been surveys of folks who have been incarcerated in both public and private prisons. So those are the sources of information when thinking about comparing those two groups, where those comparisons come from. But certainly there is more limited information from private prisons.
Okay, we have one final question.
I think this is, I directed toward Professor Montes, but maybe all of you. I mean, we're sort of blithely talking about we need good data. I think we can all agree that getting good data is really, really hard. Good systemic data. And when we say it's really hard, it's going to be really expensive. Where do we get the will to actually pay to obtain good data on recidivism, on ethnic disparity or racial disparities in this area when the stuff doesn't, it exists, but it exists scattered all over the system. And to bring that stuff together, are we willing to pay for obtaining that information? And how do we do it?
Well, I think what you're saying is how we do. We have to have buy-in from a large group of stakeholders who have access and sway. The data does exist, but it exists in different areas. So you're exactly right that it's about putting those data together. I think sort of one of the ways that we can understand if that's happening, you know, thinking again, short-term and long-term solutions, that's a long-term solution. How do we build the infrastructure to tie together the data that law enforcement have, the courts have, the correction systems have? That's a big project. That's going to take a long time. But what we can do is talk to the folks in these systems now, talk both of the people that are working in these systems, talk to our officers, talk to our prosecutors, our judges, our correctional officers, but also talk to the people that are under correctional supervision about what they're experiencing, talk to the family members of folks about what they're experiencing. Those are things that we can have, again, not tomorrow, but we could do that in a shorter amount of time than it will take us to build this infrastructure. So I certainly think you know, getting our policymakers, you mentioned a few in the room, to again, not a sexy thing to say. I understand it's hard to go back to your state constituents and say, oh, well, what's our budget look like? Well, we invested a lot in data. So, I get it, it's tough. But if we want accountability, if we want an improved system, we have to know what's happening. So.
Anyone else like to opine on that particular question?
I would just say that I agree with Professor Montez. The data exists. And to make the kind of sweeping changes that Representative Toma is talking about, which would be wonderful, we can learn from the last couple of years of COVID. These prisons and jails are incubators for the spread of a serious disease. And we've got people in these facilities for nonviolent drug offenses and are exposed, and there's no way to get away from it inside these facilities. Well, some states have gone through the process of identifying people who can be safely released back into the community in order to deal with the epidemic. We can learn from that beyond issues related to the epidemic. How many people are in prisons and jails, not because of public safety, but because of a punitive policy?
Anyone else?
The only thing I would mention is that I would agree that the data is absolutely critical, but I will also look at the types of programs within these institutions that are effective and the types of rehabilitation programs that are effective, the kinds of rehab programs that are effective. For instance, one of the things that we found out in Tennessee was that we instituted a coding program for the prisoners that was highly successful. And that was one of the most attended classes. A lot of these prisoners, they don't want to come, they don't come, and they aren't engaged. Well, this one was extremely effective, so that now that's being instituted in the rest of the prisons across the country. And the prisoners that have attended those types of coding programs, their coming back into prison is dropped dramatically. So those are the things that I think would make an absolute difference in understanding what works.
Yes.
I might as well opt in as well. At the risk of stating the obvious once again, the issues that are important to our constituents are also important to those of us that represent you. So it's important that your representatives hear that this is an investment that you think is important, you as members of the community, and you as leaders within the various areas of professions and life that you're part of. So again, I don't think we can, this isn't one of those situations where we can just point to one particular issue and say, or one particular group and say, they're the ones responsible, they're the ones that have to fix it. This really is something that's going to take all of us to figure out how to fix it, and in a way that's sustainable and in a way that's as just as possible, if you will.
Thank you so much. So it seems like we ended in a position where there was some common agreement on data, correct? All right, wonderful. Okay, thank you to all of our panelists for this engaging conversation. Let's give them all a big round of applause. Thank you so much to everyone for being here. I don't know about you, but I'm having a great time. How are you feeling? How you feel? Everybody having a great time so far? Good. Learning new information. It's great. Well, let me take a personal point of personal privilege here and introduce at this table here my colleagues from Northern Arizona University. Let me get them to stand up. Dr. Scott, let me get you and your team to stand up. Arizona Justice Educators Association, thank you guys so much for being here, okay? All right, moving forward, this is our second panel on extrajudicial punishment. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel members for this session. And again, I'm going to ask you to hold your applause until I have introduced all of them, and then we will give them all a rousing applause. First of all, Mark J. Victor founded and manages Mark J. Victor PC, which is located in Chandler, Arizona. He is an Arizona State Bar certified specialist in criminal law and has represented clients in more than 1,000 major felony cases. He holds a Juris Doctorate from Southwestern University School of Law and a Bachelor of Science in Justice Studies. Mr. Khalil Rushan. Did I pronounce that correctly? Close enough? All right. Is the Director of Community Outreach for the American Civil Liberties Union. Additionally, he serves as a mentor and resource for both the Arizona Justice Project and the SAGE Counseling Program. And then thirdly, Mr. John Clayton recently retired as an Assistant Secretary for Juvenile Corrections for the state of Washington. He is the former director of the Arizona Department of Economic Security and is currently involved in a multi-million-dollar grant program in Arizona, which is focusing on establishing a state-of-the-art reentry program for former inmates of the Arizona Correctional Institution. Let's give all of our panelists a big round of applause. So, Mr. Rushan, I'm going to start with you with your 5-minute presentation. If you could give us your perspective on this particular topic area.
Yes. Hello. So welcome, everyone. It's an honor to be here this morning. I also want to acknowledge some of my impacted folks over here at the table. But realities of this topic hits in because at 13, I actually ran away from home, troubled youth, or what some label as disconnected youth. So being out there, being involved in different things. At 22, I was charged with the first-degree murder. And, we've seen that word tossed around today. Murderers. So I was given a life sentence, served 15 and a half years of that life sentence before my case was overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct and vindictiveness. I was sent to prison for something I didn't do. So that's why I say it's an honor, but I'm also blessed and lucky to be here to even share my experiences, both as a troubled or disconnected youth, someone who was incarcerated in the system, and now a community leader to get back on the front line to address the systemic changes that need to happen. So the work we do at the ACLU is a campaign called Smart Justice. And you've heard the panelists earlier today and the conversations that needed to happen. Well, the common sense conversation is like, look, when did we stop investing in people and start investing in prisons? When did we stop investing in education, which is a preventative tool in itself? That equals public safety. When did we stop doing that? So you'll hear me mention village concept because there is no us versus you in this conversation. We're all a village member. And the village is only as strong as the weakest link in the fence.
Mr. Victor.
Can you guys hear me okay? So my name is Mark Victor, and first I want to thank you guys for having me here, and also really touched by my brother Khalil's story over here. Awesome story, my man. He hit on something I want to hit on. First of all, let me tell you just a tad about me. My name is Mark Victor. I'm a criminal defense lawyer for almost 30 years now. I founded the Attorneys for Freedom law firm. We're a law firm. We're activist attorneys. We don't just care about making money. We care about changing the world. We're very serious about changing the world. I'm going to ask everybody at some point, just take a peek at the new global peace movement that has getting ready to start called the Live and Let Live movement. Because we're talking about criminal justice here, but we're not going to fix criminal justice by just fixing criminal justice. There's a reason people enter the criminal justice system. We got to reform ourselves. Look in the mirror. If you want to know what the problem is, it's us. We need to get our own house in order. We can't just start thinking about the problem at the time that the police officers make an arrest. We shouldn't just focus on the mistakes in our system. Yeah, we don't have a perfect system. I'm the first one to tell you that. We got racism in the system. We got corruption in the system. Those are not our problems. The problems we have are us. We got to straighten out our families in our schools. We need to look in the mirror and fix ourselves. Live and let live should be our theme if we care about peace and freedom in the world. We got all these problems. They're all connected. We need to understand people look different. They live different. They think differently. It's okay. Let's defend the rights of other people to do things we think they shouldn't even do, so long as they're peaceful. We got to stop forcing our way of life on other people. Let's demand that they're not aggressors. Nobody gets to aggress. That should be the rule. But you got to let people live. I'm sorry how I bring it. I'm a former Marine. I don't bring it with any BS ever. And I'm just going to tell you, I'm running for U.S. Senate. I just found out I'm on the ballot here in Arizona, and I'm going to speak my mind. And if you don't like it, that's okay. Let's have a conversation about it. Let's just speak the truth to all my brothers and sisters out here. Yeah, my brothers and sisters out here, however you look, wherever you're from, whatever you believe about the afterlife, whatever you put in your body, if you're for peace and freedom, I'm with you. Thank you.
We have to get you to be more out there.
I know.
You're way too passive. Way too passive. All right. Mr. Clayton, how are you this morning, sir?
I'm doing great, but man, I got a heck of an act to follow. I don't know about this. Wow, I'm very impressed with both of your guys' story, and particularly if you're running for Senate, that's a good story. I don't know. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm going to be. Yeah, I'm going to be a bit different. Considerably, I'm going to be what I think the responsible administrator who's done some things in my career that's made a difference. But the reality is everything that's been said by these two gentlemen, and I was particularly impressed with what Attorney Dacey said this morning about the criminal justice system. I did not start my career as a criminal justice expert. I started my career to go to school, get a job, do some degrees in human services, social work, and I was on the other side. I was on the side that were helping community people that had run into hard times, get them back on the right track. But I actually took that throughout my career. The issue is when you grow up poor and in an environment where you see how you can make a difference in someone's life, it was something I aspired to be when I was a young kid, and that's what I achieved. But what I want to talk about in my few minutes is how you can make a difference in some of these programs if you use the right approach. Mine's going to be very simple. I actually started out in human services. I worked my way up to be CEO of human services in the state of Kentucky. I said I was retiring at 50. That didn't last very long. I came here to the state of Arizona to be director of DES. What I've always tried to do is when you walk into a position is try to make sure that you always clearly understand what your focus is, what your goal and objectives are, and how you measure it. Someone asked a question this morning about, how can we get all the money to collect the data? You cannot take that approach. You have to understand when you go into a system, data tells a story for people in human services. We in human services too long have been people that go out and do the right thing, think because we're doing the right thing, that's always going to resonate. It doesn't work that way. Any program that you're working in at any level, always collect your data, always collect your information. So that's something I've always done. So let me tell you about my experience in the state of Washington. In the state of Washington, we had a program called juvenile rehabilitation. What we were trying to do is get the funding to utilize in that program to bring some evidence-based approaches into what we do. So what we were able to do is go to the legislature, talk to a research arm of the legislature that was about business. And, you can come in with your good feelings and all of that, but if you didn't come in with your business case, and show how you were going to support your business case with data, you're likely not going to get funded. So what we did is we wanted to develop some programs that were evidence-based for youth that had committed offenses, serious offenses, and they were coming into my care. I was at that time Assistant Secretary for Juvenile Justice. So what they were doing is coming into our program. What we wanted to do is develop some evidence-based programs to show if you apply these principles to youth that are coming into the system, you're going to reduce recidivism considerably. So that's essentially what I did. I had a researcher to come in from that research arm who worked with me on a daily basis. We developed a program, therapeutic program, based on what works for youth at a certain age. We had people that had an expertise in that area to come in. We developed an evidence-based program. Right now in the state of Washington, it's recognized as one of the best in the nation. As a matter of fact, we had 4 different countries to come in to review what we were doing, because what we were doing is making a difference. Cognitive behavioral therapy has been utilized there. We were making a difference in the life of youth that were coming out of our system. So what we decided also we needed to do is to develop some reentry programs that were evidence-based. And we developed reentry programs that involve jobs in the community. We had employers that are tied to training programs that we put into effect, and we were able to make a difference. If you look nationwide at what's going on in criminal justice, the picture has not been good. But if you look at juvenile justice, youth that are in the system, if you look at the system in 1996 compared to now, what you see is that less than half of the number of kids that were in the system today as they were in 1996. Now, that's not all, it's not all good. The reality is in my state, my state at that time was Washington, we had actually reduced incarceration by over 50%. And that was great. You know, we were feeling very good about that. But when we started digging deeper and looking at the data, what we show is that although the overall reduction in youth that have been incarcerated was way down, we were feeling good about that. What we also found is that when we look at who was left in the system, pretty much it was people that looked like me. It was youth of color that was still left in the system. So we actually started to put together some approaches to address that. And we have got grants and funds from different agencies, from the federal government and also from nonprofit agencies, and started applying certain principles to actually reduce that. I can't say I finally, after 13 years in Washington, I retired. I said I was going to go work 2 years when I went there. I ended up working 13 because it's something I couldn't step away from. We actually developed some very innovative approaches. So that's what I want to talk about. And I know you're going to hear a lot about the criminal justice system in the United States and how inefficient it is. I don't disagree with any of that, but I'm saying that if you use creative approaches, come up with evidence-based approaches in dealing with criminal justice, you can make a difference. Now, I'm concerned that if you look at the lessons that have been learned in the juvenile justice system, if you look at the number of people that were incarcerated in 1996 compared to now and look at what happened there, I think there's some lessons to be learned. And I was going to ask the doctors if she's done any studies to compare the criminal justice system overall and looking at youth system as opposed to the adult system. I don't see some of those things that are happening in the adult system. I'm not an expert in the adult system. I do read about it. But what I think that what we can learn from that is that if you use evidence-based approaches, and collect data and have an overall mission and philosophy that you want to utilize, you can make a difference in the criminal justice system. It's been proven. So that's going to be my approach.
Let's get into our questions. Let's start with you, Mr. Rushdown, if I may. Criminal justice literature refers to something called the disparate minority confinement, or DMC, as being reflective of the difference in offending rates among different racial or ethnic groups. Some researchers suggest issues such as poverty, substance abuse, job opportunities, and high crime rates in predominantly minority neighborhoods place minority youth at higher risk for delinquent behaviors. Is there any truth to that? Is this DMC just a figment of some researcher's imagination?
So, I mean, when you're conducting research, it's never a figment of anyone's imagination. You're conducting that research, you're interviewing people, and depending on the scope of the surveys that are conducted, whatever. I ask one question. When it comes to minority communities, are any one of these researchers from that impacted community? And the reason being, it's important to understand, these solutions are elusive, no matter where you're at. So to pinpoint and say, hey, like in my instance, when I ran away at 13, most people would say, well, you ever see your father? No. No interaction with your father? No. Okay, well, that's why you went through what you went through. And that's not the case, because my mom was strong as two people. I knew better, right? The biggest thing was young, knowledgeable, 13-year-old, but I couldn't control my emotions. That was the problem. And so I say this, when you're conducting research, it's hard to group these issues into, to say it's just pinpointed at one issue. It's even harder to come up with the solution when we're dealing in real time. And that's the problem with a lot of research. By the time it's conducted, it's compiled into reports, and then you actually come up with the solution that you think you can implement, it's years down the road. And so it's hard to catch things in real time. And so the biggest part of that is we are looking at things on a case-by-case basis. So when you start to push policy or implement or take legislation and make it laws, now you're throwing this big blanket and everybody has to fit into that box. And so when we're looking at, our juveniles that are getting impacted or we're getting impacted, you're trying to fit them into a model that might not be the best thing for them. I'm gonna be honest, and I put my own neck on the chopping block. I wasn't a bad kid. I was an immature jerk that needed to learn how to grow up. And I didn't have those mentors and those guys that were in my life, the people that showed me or could have showed me how to work on cars or other things, fish. Didn't have that. So I'm just gonna say it's hard to pinpoint what it is, and we're in 2022. I'm 48, I'm still a baby though, I'm still young. But please, anyone stand up and let me know if we have solutions today. No, we're still looking. We're still doing research. And the other thing too, Parks and Recreation were free. Boys and Girls Club were free. You had these programs, they were free. Now they cost money. And so going back to what we invest in, I'm gonna say now we kind of invest more into research than we actually put into programs that can give people something to do. And then another dynamic of everything. I was young, I remember you had one shift. How many people remember you had 8 to 5 shift, Monday through Friday, you were off on the weekends, you really didn't have a graveyard shift unless you were like in the hospital or somewhere. Now you got 3 shifts. And even with both parents living in the house, reality of it is like both parents are probably working full-time jobs to put their kids through college. So I mean, even with 2 parents in the house, we're still seeing youth being disconnected. We're still seeing youth get in trouble. So I want to say there's a mentoring element, there's an investment in time, those type of things, but it's even harder to pinpoint what a solution would be. Got it old school, jump in, get your hands dirty, case by case basis.
Let me come to Mr. Victor first, okay? Mr. Victor, do you have an opinion on this?
I might be able to muster something. Again, we've met the enemy and the enemy is us, really. There's a lot to unpack here. So I'm going to start unpacking some things for you. 28 years in the criminal justice system. Do we have racism? Yeah. Do we have corruption? Do we have bad cops? Yeah. None of those are our problems. Truly, I can tell you, I have spent 28 years looking to raise the issue in court that my client, and I have represented clients of all backgrounds and all types, my client is being treated differently because of the color of their skin, because of where they're from, because of their religious background. I've raised it once. It's really not our problem. Yes, we see endless videos of police officers doing bad things, because there's always police officers doing bad things, but we see every single thing they do that's bad now. Then we make a mistake by generalizing that to all police. Police are not the problem. None of this is the problem. Our thinking is the problem. If this conference was happening just a few decades ago, the issue on the table would not be, we got to get people out of prison, we got to shorten sentences. It would be, we need to make them longer, right? That's what the talk was just a few decades ago. There's a pendulum. It swings this way. 1 minute, the Democrats are going to save us. Oh, then they screwed everything up. Now the Republicans are going to save us. Oh, they screwed everything up. Now back to we got to stop with the treadmill. I just want to give you an example of something. I debated publicly many times legalization of marijuana. And I want an apology from everybody I debated. The horrors that were presented that would happen if we legalized marijuana. Do you know how many lives have been ruined over this? And lives that are still today ruined over this? People driving it, people growing it, people selling it. Now we say this ain't no big deal. We wonder why we have so many people in prison. How many people argued, oh my God, if gay people can get married, it'll be the destruction of the American family. I want an apology from them too. Gambling was illegal forever. Oh my God, if we legalize gambling, hell will break loose. I want an apology from them too. There's a pattern here. We shouldn't put people in prison for moral crimes. We got to stop with this. I'll also tell you, I've read, I don't know how many pre-sentence reports at this point in my career. Hundreds of thousands probably. I see patterns. These police officers here know who they're arresting, and they know why they're arresting them. We know why they're arresting them as well. We got to do better as parents. I'm a dad, and it's the most important job that I have. Don't be a parent if you're not willing to undertake the serious responsibility of raising people to join a free country. We got to change our thinking. There are many things I would love to get you guys to pay for. There's lots of things I think are important. I'd like to try to persuade you to pay for things, but I got no business forcing you to pay for anything. That ain't my role. You're in charge of you. You got to be the iron-fisted dictator of you. Your body, your property, your money, your time. We all have ideas about how the world should be. We've got to take those out of the law. If we just did that, we wouldn't have to talk about getting people out of prison. And you don't even realize the secondary effects here. Do you know? I've represented people in real crimes. I had a real burglary one time. We were going to trial on it. There was blood found at the scene. I said to the prosecutor, hey man, are you gonna test the blood? Because I knew how it was gonna come back. Why are we going to trial here? He said, no, we don't have money in the budget for that. But I made him test the green leafy substance every single time. And they never said, sorry, we're not gonna spend the money. We've wasted resources prosecuting people for stupid, victimless crimes. I was in federal court just recently defending a peaceful man on a gambling room case. Gambling. A guy went to prison for adults wagering their money in an illegal gambling poker room. We got to stop with this stuff. Let's persuade people to act better, not force them to act better. This is what creates the conflict in our society. This is what we need to fix. I didn't give you the website last time. I'm gonna say that and I'm gonna shut up and sit down. liveandletlive.org. If you want to be part of the solution, there's a global peace movement going on. That's our community now. That's our community. I live in Chandler. My community is the globe. Threats come from all over the globe now. Have we noticed the last 2 years? We see what's going on in Ukraine. Threats are all over the world. That's our community. That's our people. We need to think differently. We need a paradigm shift. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Victor. Mr. Clayton, do you have a perspective on DMC?
Absolutely do, but I'm going to be brief about this. If you want to know more about DMC, and people talk about what is it and what approaches you want to use, I actually worked a lot with DMC projects in my career. I've been retired 3 years. So before I started to come to speak, I just said, oh, I think I'll Google DMC and see what they have on it. Amazing amount of information. You know, there are studies out there that I didn't even know existed. So if you're really serious about wanting to know about DMC, just Google the subject and you're going to run into more information than you have time to read. But what you will find is that there are certain approaches that are recommended, and there are certain things that you will recognize. Number one, disproportionate minority contacts usually starts with children in schools. You know, a kid has an attitude or doesn't conform with the rules of the school, gets sent to the principal, gets sent to suspension, and it escalates from there. That's one of the things you'll find. You'll also find that sometimes parents aren't engaged enough with the youth, so the youth get to the point where they get involved in the criminal justice system. You'll also find a point that we're not proud of is that at every point in the system where you're talking about schools, police officers, judges, even the criminal justice system in terms of care after they get into the system, at every point that they come in contact, there's a different treatment for them than the majority population. In other words, if they go in with the same circumstance, usually they're going to come out with a worse result. That's reality. There's a lot of studies that have been done to show that. So if you actually want to fix the system, what they say is that one of the things you have to do is gather your data, know exactly where the issues are, where the problems are. You have to get community groups and everybody involved in saying, we want to change this. And if you think about the juvenile justice system from the past when we actually want to incarcerate everybody, we were incarcerating a youth for truancy, a whole lot of other things that could be handled by community groups. That's what the studies show you, is that get people involved, get a system in place, and understand that the last thing you want to do is to see a youth ends up into prison or the deep end of a criminal justice system because of something they do that's normal behavior that knuckleheads like me got into when I was a teenager. So there's lots of literature out there. If you actually want to address these issues, there's not only literature telling you about all the data about what's the issue, but also approaches you can actually take to make a difference. So I encourage you to use that approach.
Which time you wanted to make a further comment?
Yeah, I wanted to further, just know that, we do some good research. There's some bad research. The problem is implementing it. You know, that separation of people being knowledgeable, but not being wise enough to implement it. And I think and then the other part of that is having that patience to see it through, because some of these solutions, people grab them and think it's microwavable, we can pop it in and we can start. No, solutions come over time. And, we're still seeing some of the remnants of bad decisions in truth and sentencing, so to say. Truth and sentencing, which was discussed earlier, mandatory 85%, 1994, several states jumped on board, started adopting it, which that mass incarceration is not a myth. We've seen numbers go up. Now, here we are today. Can anybody guess real quick how many states still have the mandatory 85% truth in sentencing?
About 28.
Nope.
Somewhere around there.
3.
3?
And Arizona is one of them. So I just wanted to say that, we have to move on. We have to not be afraid to address this legislation in the past has started us on the wrong, on a bad journey. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, so let's transition to the next question. So, Mr. Clayton, I'm going to ask you the question this time, okay?
Okay.
So given the stress that our youth have experienced during the past 2 years with COVID restrictions, remote learning, et cetera, what measures can we as a society implement to ensure that our children don't find their way into the juvenile justice system? Are there promising strategies we can implement in Arizona that will help our youth in not becoming one of the numbers? Based on your experiences from Washington, what do you recommend?
Good question. I would say big picture, if I were tackling this issue, I would look to see who's doing it well now. Just don't think that you have to start everything from scratch if you're trying to come up with a solution. So, for example, when I was doing my reading last night, I found that what systems in the world are considered the best in terms of how they deal with youth community issues. And what I found is that there are a list about they rate the countries in terms of how they deal with youth and the criminal justice system. Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Finland, Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Kenya were considered the 7 tops in terms of how they actually manage issues of youth, juvenile delinquency in the system. And essentially what they do, they have a system that, number one, you have to look at it being community-based. You can't decide that every time a youth commits an offense or does something that goes against the grain, that you're actually going to some way incarcerate them or get them involved with the police system or the court system. You have to have a community-based approach first. Let that be the first approach. And the reality is the community should be the one that has responsibility for this, the community and the parent. So I would make sure that I did that. Number 2, I would actually make sure that I have a system in place that's ready to deal with this. You know, we can't sit back and wait till something happens and then say, oh, wow, we need to create something to do that. No, it's too late then. You actually need to make sure that you invest in systems up front, predict what the behavior is going to be, because it's not that hard to figure out what the behavior is going to be and have something in place to deal with it. We have to make sure that we understand that our systems have to be equipped to handle this. Police system needs to be funded appropriately for it, but police systems should not always be used as a matter of intervention. Sometimes we complain about the police, what they do, but what are we doing to prevent circumstances getting to the point where the police have to be called? I mean, you know, they're not the bad guys. It's the system that's the bad guys. And the fact that we haven't been constructive enough and sitting down and thinking about, oh, these issues are going to happen with youth. What do we have in place to manage it? So to me, planning is the biggest issue. And I think there's already been recognition throughout the nation that COVID is going to bring on certain challenges, and there's been funding that's been put together to actually deal with the issue. The issue is, are there enough plans? And I would think number 1, making sure there's community-based approaches and making sure that you have all the different partners that you know are going to have to deal with these issues, come together and develop a collaborative plan.
Mr. Victor, you talk about parents. Yes, go right ahead. Give them a round of applause. Talk about the parents needing to do more. I think that's what you said.
That's what I said.
Okay, so if we take that and we focus it on what has happened over the past 2 years with COVID and the restrictions and everything, what do you think parents should do? What are your recommendations?
Yeah, tough to answer this in 5 minutes, right? But I'll do my best to try to convey a few points. I remember when my kids were little, they used to be upset with me because every Sunday at noon, I told them they had a class. And it was my class. They had to show up at noon. If they showed up at 12:01, I treated them like the Marine Corps drill instructor would have treated me had I shown up 1 second late. And so they understood the value of being where you're supposed to be when you're supposed to be there. And I remember one particular class that I taught them. This was a hard one. I really had to prepare for it. I was going to teach them, hey, there's people out there in the world that they look different than you. And there's people, they're gay and they like other people of the same sex. And I did this whole big, presentation for my kids and they taught me something. They looked at me when I was done like I was crazy. They thought, why would we care about this kind of stuff? And it occurred to me something important. Our kids, they're not born racist. They're not born hating other people. In fact, if you have had the privilege like I have to travel around the world and visit people in different countries, yeah, you find differences. They look different. They eat different foods. They celebrate different holidays. But you'll get a real education on how similar we are. That's what struck me. People pick your place in the world. Any country you want. Pick the craziest one ever. I can tell you about the people there. They want to raise their kids. They want good food. They want their kids to have better lives than them. They like hanging out with their friends and listening to music. They're happy when it's the weekend. They can hang out. They're like us. Imagine if we taught our kids differently. Hey, you're in the oppressed group. You're in the oppressor group. You're this variety of kid. You're that variety. What are we doing? Why are we creating this hatred? Why can't we celebrate the differences? Why can't we say, hey, somebody eats different food, celebrates a different holiday. Can I celebrate with you? Why can't we teach our kids like this? We got to get there, right? We got to also recognize that some people won't teach their kids like that. They'll teach their kids to hate and to act badly. What we should require of them is to not be aggressors. You can be a jerk, but you got to be peaceful if you're a jerk, right? You got to be peaceful. It's like people ask me, hey, Mark, you're going to run for Senate. What are you going to say about the BLM? I'm going to say the same thing about the BLM that I'm going to say about everybody and everything and every issue. I don't care what you believe. You want to march down the street? This is America. March down the street. You want to break windows and throw chairs around and steal stuff? Sorry. You don't get to do that. I don't care what your cause is. Let's treat people the same way. Let's have the same standard for everybody. Yeah, and if it's just about keeping kids out of prison, we could just say kids don't go to prison anymore. That would solve that. Is that really what we want? Or we want to get them to act differently? We need to get them to act differently. And I'm sorry, the government can't solve this problem. The government can't solve it. I'm not running for office to say I can solve it. We need to stop looking at them in the government to solve the problem. We're the problem. Until we can start taking responsibility for our kids and for ourselves and how we speak and how we act and who we have in our circle of friends and why. We're going to have all these same problems again. We'll be back here next year talking about, in 10 years, we'll be back saying, you know what? We lightened up the sentences on everybody and that didn't work. What we need is longer sentences again. Let's criminalize this, that, and the next thing. I want off the train. I want to make the world better than it is now. And we can't do that unless we're big enough to step up and say, you know what? I support the rights of other people to act in ways I don't think they should act. They can do things that are unhealthy, unwise, immoral, all of those things that I don't want them to do. And I can try to persuade them to act differently, but I defend their right to act in ways that I disagree with. It's like a First Amendment issue, right? I defend to the death your right to say what you want, even if and especially when I disagree with it. If we're not willing to say that, America ain't special anymore. We're not. We claim we're special. We need to not just sing the songs. We need to be special again, which means we need to get our heads screwed on straight. It's on us. Stop doing the same things we've been doing. That's all I got on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Richstein, you talked a few minutes ago about your mom being a single mother. Said you didn't know your dad. I believe that's what you said. But you said that your mom was a super strong woman. So how do parents do better? Talk to those single moms out there for just a minute. What was it that your mom did that made a difference in your life?
My mom had a presence. And like I said earlier, the biggest thing we're seeing now is like, even with two parents or two adults in the household, both of them are working full time. Cost of living has gone up. So, you know, how much quality time are being spent with kids? Doesn't matter what occupation you're in, law enforcement, medical, education. So most of the time we're putting our kids in front of, you know, I had a daughter 6 years old. I think what Lion King was out. I used to put it on VHS tape, remember those? And it would keep her entertained for hours because she would never finish the movie. She got halfway through and she started over, she started doing something else. I mean, what are we occupying our kids' time with now? In absence of our presence. So the biggest thing, the biggest problem I have, and I was actually triggered by the previous panel, right? Because we spend 1.5 billion just to house people. It's about 1.5 since the last year, 1.5 billion to house people in the state. That's the state prison. Okay, so now we have the private prisons. And so the bigger concern is education, because I've seen where they're cutting teachers' salaries by 5,000. And so I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not the brightest person in the world, might not have solutions to everything, but if you're not investing in education and you're putting money in prisons and you're allowing them to come and get more money, and we're not really looking at like our teachers outside of you as a parent, your teachers are probably going to be the most or the second most important person in the development of your child. They're spending more time, and in some instances, spending more time with your child than you. Why are we not putting that investment there? So COVID kind of just exposed what we kind of knew already. And it forced people to the table to start, wait, we need to fix some things. So one of those is like, I'm totally against school resource officers being in prison. I mean, excuse me, being in schools. I'm triggered. Hey, no. But I'm saying being in schools, because before we can get to that, why are we not having, especially during the pandemic, why are we not giving our kids more access to counselors? And those counselors are able to work with the students, work with the teachers, work with the parents to kind of bridge the traumas associated with the pandemic, because all of us lost somebody. Some of these students, these kids, these children have lost parents, grandparents, people they love. And what we did was said, hey, you're not gonna have to wear a mask. You should just be focusing on keeping your mask on in school, but go back to the school. I mean, that whole argument, with or against, we pushed and then some parents was like, man, I didn't know it was this hard raising kids, because now I'm forced to stay home, I'm working from home, kids running through the back of your Zoom videos and the whole nine, right? We like, sit down somewhere. So when they said, hey, let's go back to school, nobody really checked to see if these kids were all right. That's what the pandemic exposed. So as a village, all of us are obligated, regardless of your political party, regardless of your occupation. These children are our investment. And so when they start acting out, the first solution is not, hey, let's put them in a bed. Let's incarcerate them. And I'm not saying that's not every person's objective, of course, in it, but no, I mean, I have a problem with that. Because now your common sense factor is gone, your compassion's gone, and you're profit driven. that's when these children become criminal or these issues, these moral issues, as my man said, become criminalized.
Okay, thank you. We have a time. Yeah. Let's give a round of applause. A few questions from the audience, just a very few. Okay, here I go.
This is for Mr. Clayton. Thank you for what you did at the juvenile court. My experience being in the court as an interpreter, not knowing the criminal justice system, most of the times parents become victimized because of the cultural barrier. When the kids are acting up certain way and the parents are doing their utmost best to do the best, but the difference between the Western culture or their origin culture, that's the conflict. And sometimes I saw over and over, even in the adult court, the lawyers or the judge even fail to understand that. So in your system, is there any way, no, I'm not talking about just cultural diversity training, in the court system, that kind of incorporation, is there any opportunity or you have done something like that?
Well, I would say that if you have the family court approach, that usually lessens that, but I will not sit here and tell you that that's totally.
Yeah, get you to use your mic because people can't hear.
I would say that in the family court process, you have less of that as opposed to the bigger criminal justice court approach. I can't tell you that it goes away though, because a lot of times it is adversarial process. You have prosecutors that are, they have a job to do and they're bringing forth a case. Sometimes parents can't afford attorneys, so all that comes into play. I can't tell you that's going away. But what I did see in the state of Washington is that we try to develop a family court process to make it more friendly. But you have to understand that even in the family court process, it's still the focus is always what's in the best interest of the child. So sometimes the parent who's had custody of the child for a long period of time, sometimes the court may not look friendly on the actions they've taken in the past. So you have to take that into consideration.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay, here we come.
Doctor, you're getting some good exercise.
Yes, I am. This is good. Thank you.
So Khalil, this question is for you, coming from community partnerships. So working in national criminal justice reform, I often hear that the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution, yet we don't often see that in practice. So you talk about research and all of these things that are happening that aren't involving the people who are truly involved in these communities, in the trenches. You have the police stakeholders, the legal stakeholders, yet we keep out the most important stakeholder, which are those that are affected. So what differences do you think we could make by including those that are formerly incarcerated? And do you think that would, make a larger difference if we actually brought in the people who understand what they've been through rather than just assigning what they've been through to them?
Absolutely. I had, and thank you for asking that question. I had 15 and a half years to understand, get to know myself, understand what happened and be able to articulate it. And so, not everyone is in that position, but I always say there's a thin line between racism and implicit bias. Neither one of them benefited me. And so, I talk about implicit bias on a scale that people have to get comfortable knowing like, hey, I need to create a seat for those who are impacted. Because how you have a conversation about criminal justice reform without the people who have successfully transitioned from it, or those who are directly impacted. And so I see that a lot because people see me and they say, oh man, he must be a football player. I've been called a Marine. Some people thought I was a parole officer when I show up in these spaces. And then when they hear my story, they're like, wow, I wouldn't have guessed. but you have to be comfortable making those seats at the table. That's how you're gonna get closer to a solution, incorporating the people who have been impacted. And so the work I've done, I've worked with lawmakers on both sides. I don't care about the politics. I don't care, I'm a registered independent. I'm not gonna be ping pong. Hey, who wants to come into the community and start working on solutions? That's where I'm at. So, you know, good question. And whoever's interested in furthering their knowledge of smart justice can hit me at the table.
Okay, final question. We'll run out of time.
My question is to Mr. Clayton. Okay. God bless Arizona and its inadequacies in a lot of areas. One of the things is this foster care system is an embarrassment. So what did you do in the state of Washington with the foster care system? If you are looking at the family services courts and things, how can we fix that here?
Wow, you know, I
know that's a whole hour probably.
that would be a long conversation. I would have to say, even in the state of Washington that I worked in, the foster care system is still not perfect. It still has a lot of things that need to be improved. But there was a focus in the state of Washington of setting up a department, particularly to deal with that. Now, some people say, well, that's a structure. But with a philosophy that's been studied at a national level and brought in some best practices. So what I found enlightening about working in the state of Washington, I worked in both states, is that they did have a big focus for a long period of time of working on evidence-based practices. And that was a part of the legislature, the research agency that was set aside. If you actually wanted to do something new and innovative, what you had to do is get a legislature to take that ideal to that research arm. The research arm would do the work and collect the data and make sure that if you're coming up with a new program, it's not just that you feel good about it. There was some evidence to prove that it worked. For example, in my work in juvenile justice, we had to come up with an approach to show the initiatives that we were putting in place would actually reduce recidivism. So it actually was studied over a period of time. We had to do a report every year, had a consultant come in and look at the data, give a report on what the outcomes were. And that's worked beautifully. And the way it worked for me, I could go out and sell my programs, and I could sell it to someone to say, you don't have to be conservative. I don't care if you're conservative, liberal, Democrat, or Republican. What I'm doing is showing you how this affects taxpayers and how it affects your bottom line. And therefore, people usually were more on board about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for our panelists. Going to be going into a 10-minute break, but coming up next is our session on police reform. You don't want to go anywhere. Come back. Wow, you got quiet. You see the speakers up here, you're in your seats, you're all set, you're ready to go, right? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You get it.
I do.
You get it. You ready to go?
Yeah.
All right, we're going to take off here. Thank you so much. This session is on police reform. And as I prepared for this particular presentation, I was looking at some of the literature. And I looked at an article from the Police Executive Research Forum, sometimes referred to as PERF. And it says the job of leading a law enforcement agency has been a complex one, requiring skills in mastering complex policy issues, developing organizational structures and systems, managing employees, and addressing the various and sometimes conflicting expectations of the community, political leaders, agency employees, and the news media. Doesn't that sound like a job you want? Absolutely, absolutely. Our final panel today focuses on police reform, and we will hear from well-known law enforcement leaders, a professor who is considered an expert in the area of policing, and a legislator who is an advocate for public safety. So let us begin. Representative Weiniger could not join us today, but we do have someone else, and Representative Blackman, I lost your bio.
Oh, sorry.
Representative Blackman was kind enough to join us. He is, excuse me, Chief. He is a representative in the Arizona House of Representatives, representing the 6th District. He is the first Black Republican elected to the Arizona State Legislature. Give him a round of applause. But even more so, he served 21 years in the United States Army and earned a Bronze Star for combat action as a tank commander in Iraq. That deserves a round of applause. And I understand you're running for the United States Congress. Is that true? Yes, sir. You sure you want that job? Also, we have with us Police Chief Sean Duggan. I'm sorry, Duggan. Duggan? Okay, Sean Duggan. He was appointed as the Chief of Police for the City of Chandler in 2014 after serving 27 years with the Scottsdale Police Department. Throughout his career, the chief has advanced the tenets of community policing, developing a deep-rooted history of community engagement and participation. Also, Dr. Charles Katz, who is the Watts Endowed Family Chair of the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. His research involves collaborating with agencies to increase their organizational capacity to identify and respond to crime affecting their local communities. He regularly collaborates with local and international organizations to develop comprehensive strategic plans to reform police agencies and diagnose problems related to the crime and violence. Last, but certainly not least, the incredible Sheriff of Maricopa County. Sheriff Paul Penzone has a combined 30 years of law enforcement and public safety experience. Under Sheriff Penzone's leadership, the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office is committed to a mission of ethical, effective, and impactful law enforcement and public safety. Give them all a big round of applause, please. The chief has agreed to start with his presentation. Chief, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford, and good morning, everyone. Still kind of nervous after hearing the summary of the job of the police chief. So, but I do want to thank everyone for being here, and certainly thank the chamber for hosting this. These are very important discussions, and just a great opportunity to learn from one another. But when we talk about police reform, I think it's very important first to preface that and just put the term police in context in this country. Policing, by and large, is very much at the local level, like politics in our nation. In fact, there are 18,000 different police departments in the United States. There's no national police department. There's no national standards. Policing is very much local. And those departments range from the largest NYPD with 35,000 officers to an average size department in this country with 22 officers. So today, when I speak about reform, I am representing the Chandler Police Department as the Chandler Police Chief. I am not speaking for other chiefs, whether regionally here or let alone elsewhere in the country. But I can say that the term reform is not alien to the Chandler Police Department. In fact, reform, or as I like to call it, evolution, some people call it transition, that is part of the fabric of our organization, and it has been for years. Our department is continually learning and assessing and changing and evolving, whether it's our policies and procedures, our tactics, our training, our equipment, our technology. constantly changing. It's not a day that goes by that we don't learn something. And the way we learn things is by paying attention. So our heads on a swivel, we're learning from what's happening in our own department when we do things well to ensure we continue to do things well. If we make a mistake, we learn from our mistakes and do better. But we're learning from every other department here in the region, nationally and internationally. So reform is a very common phrase, and it's something, again, that's built into our culture. So I want to give just a couple examples of things as far as paying attention and having vision and predicting and forecasting. And the first one is our body-worn camera program. We've had a body-worn camera program for 9 years. This is not something that we were compelled to do. A court didn't order us to do this. It's not a consent decree. 9 years ago, when it was not a huge issue, we recognized the technology of body-worn cameras, how it collects compelling evidence, how it may help de-escalate a situation, how it holds people accountable, whether our officers or the public, and how it adjudicates cases faster. And as a result, result in less or secondary trauma to victims. So we recognize that, we built that over time. And we started with a few cameras and eventually went to full implementation. But it's something that we did on our own based on learning and assessing and knowing what's on the horizon. Another example of paying attention and involvement was back in 2015. Recall in 2014, we had a very violent riots in Ferguson. In end of 2014, President Obama convened a group and they produced a report on 21st century policing that was put out in 2015. And there were 6 different pillars, titles, and 59 recommendations. The first thing we did when that came out is we looked at that report and we compared and contrasted to what we do here in Chandler. And by and large, overwhelmingly, those recommendations were already part of our fabric. They were already happening, but there were things that we did learn and we changed, whether it's our use of force reporting. We created a policy, even though it was part of our practice, but it wasn't a policy, to render aid. So after an officer is violently assaulted, after the situation is calm, that officer then transitions from warrior to guardian and then renders aid to that suspect who moments earlier was trying to assault that officer. That's one of the changes we implemented. And perhaps the biggest one is duty to intervene. If you see an officer next to you doing something inappropriately, it is your expectation policy to intervene and stop that action. This is 5 years before George Floyd was murdered. So we have vision, and we are in a constant state of change. And one of the points of pride when it came to the 21st century policing report is back in 2016, when we were invited, representatives from our department went to the Obama White House, and we presented on how we implemented those changes, how we compared and contrast, how we reported out. So a very important sense of pride. So I just want to convey that in Chandler, we are growing every day, we're learning, and we're in a constant state of reform. Thank you.
Dr. Katz.
Thank you.
You can use yours. The gentleman back there in the corner, he's keying the mics for you.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for having, never been to the college here. Thanks for having us. Beautiful.
It's a great place.
It's a beautiful college. It is. It's great. Charles Katz from Arizona State University. I just wanted to briefly talk about what it's like to reform an agency and difficulty involving police reform. Policing is unlike many other professions. In local law enforcement agencies, I'm going to not talk about sheriff's departments because they are very different than local police agencies in a number of different ways. But when we're talking about police reform, it's a lot more complicated than simply saying we need to change the police. It's very difficult. It's like moving a battleship, moving it in a different direction. And when we are evaluating the police, we're all looking at it from different perspectives. When you're talking to police officers and you're talking about change, I oftentimes feel like it's talking to my 3 children, right? I got a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old, a 16-year-old. I'm talking to my son, he's going to go out, hang out with his friends. And I say, I want you to be careful with this. I want you to, think about these issues. And he's nodding his head, and he's nodding his head. And he's going to do damn well whatever he wants to do anyways, right? Within reason. Police departments are tough and they have to look at things from a variety of different perspectives. Police departments, people, with the exception of the chief, for the most part, when a mistake occurs, it is very difficult to change the organization, in large part because it's very difficult to deal with. It's not like when we have a problem with the police department, we're going to get rid of all the police officers. That's not going to happen, right? Or very rarely happens. That has happened, but it's very rare. We don't give the chief a raise when crime goes down. For the most part, we don't get rid of a chief when crime goes up, with very few exceptions. Instead, one of the #1 predictors of any reform taking place is when a single incident occurs. And as a result, you have agencies that are oftentimes very risk averse, and they have a tough job in terms of having to make slow incremental changes, because most of policing is evaluated based not on the effectiveness of the job that they're doing, but based on the legitimacy that they have within the community. What I mean by legitimacy is, how do different aspects of the community perceive that they're doing? How good of a job do they believe that they're doing? As a result, it's really tough to make changes when a lot of what a police department has to do is first and foremost deal with how they're being perceived in the community and having to maintain their legitimacy from different aspects of the community. And they have to evaluate which parts of the community are most important to listen to in an effort to maintain the legitimacy within their community. It's a tough job. With that being said, we know that there are a number of reforms that need to take place within policing, and they're not going to take place within a short period of time. I did bring a few books that myself and my colleagues wrote on some of the necessary aspects of police reform. And these are data-driven reforms that we believe need to take place. And first and foremost, what we need to see are greater efforts placed into strategic crime control. When we're looking at addressing crime within the communities, we need to think about it in a very strategic sense. But that can sometimes be very difficult. When we're talking about strategic crime control and evidence-based policing, what that means is we're focused on areas where we have the most crime, we're focused on the people that engage in the most crime, and we're trying to address and prevent those victims that are most likely to be victimized, right? On the contrary, many of our police officers are focused on random preventative patrol, right? Most police departments, it's somewhere around 60 to 80%, right? That involves officers driving around until a call for service occurs. They respond to the call for service, which is an essential part of any police department. But the fact of the matter is, we've known for 40 years that random preventative patrol has zero effect on crime, right? But the public, all of us, expect them to be driving around in circles to maintain safety within their communities, right? So instituting things like hotspot patrol, where instead of an officer driving around in circles randomly, you identify those areas where the most crime is, and you just have your officer park there for 20 minutes. And then you move them to another hotspot and you have them park there for 20 minutes, creates a lot of complications, in large part because some businesses don't want the cops sitting there for 20 minutes, right? There's a lot of issues with it. We need to first and foremost think about issues of crime control. We need safe communities, bar none. That's the #1 job of the police. However, we do need to engage in issues involving equity, right? We do have issues around use of force, particularly in the Southwest. In the Southwest, the public is much more accepting of use of force than other parts of the country. The police are going to be representative of what the public wants in policing. We all get, for the most part, the exact type of policing services we ask for, right? So it's not until the public starts to demand that there be changes that we're going to see any changes in policing. And right now in policing, we live in the Southwest, and use of force is more acceptable here than other places. So we should accept that shift is going to take a longer period of time than perhaps in other jurisdictions, right? We also need to think about how we're going to reduce racial inequality in terms of arrests, contacts with the police. We know that that is an issue. It's unclear about the long-term effects of those problems, but we do know that it's an issue in some communities more so than in other communities. We very clearly have seen it. We've seen consent decrees in some cities in the United States where the problem is really substantial. In the Southwest, we have not seen some of those types of problems. One of the things that we're fortunate with in the Southwest and this area is we see very little corruption within law enforcement agencies, the way we see it on the East Coast. Oftentimes people talk about corruption, financial types of corruption. We don't see those types of issues here. Instead, our issues are primarily focused on use of force, shootings, and the such. There's a couple of other things that are now starting to turn into more mainstream activity, but reforms that are necessary. One is body-worn cameras. Body-worn cameras are having a substantial impact in policing. Unfortunately, they're having a substantial cost crisis in terms of policing as well. It is a massive financial, if you want to call it, burden on agencies and maintaining that data, maintaining the infrastructure that is required. It's a lot. And pretty soon we're going to start to see municipalities have to deal with those budgetary constraints. But we're seeing dividends in it in terms of reduced complaints. And we also are seeing it in terms of dividends, and the police officers are much more likely to proactively stop individuals that they suspect of criminal activity. So it's sort of having a simultaneous effect in terms of allowing them to be more proactive and at the same time receive fewer complaints. And we also see benefits in terms of prosecution. For instance, in domestic violence, we see arrests double, we see prosecutions double and convictions double when there's body-worn camera video present. We do see some dividends there. And the last issue that the chief mentioned is we're going to have to start dealing with personnel issues. There is an emerging crisis in policing with not enough police officers. There's a couple reasons for that. In policing today, this is true for the past 100 or so years, people become police officers for two reasons, right? They become a police officer to help people, and they become an officer because it's a good job. It pays well, good benefits by many people's standards, but we're starting to lose some of that, right? We're starting to see a little bit different perception. We have seen a decline in perceptions of the police. That is going to start to hamper the number of individuals that are applying for policing. I do have a feeling like that's going to start to shift and start to move in the other direction here shortly. But I think that we're going to start to need to think about how we're going to fill those ranks in non-traditional ways. And one of those ways that I promise you is going to be occurring over the next 30 years is increased civilianization of the police. The civilians are going to start to play an increasing role in terms of police activities that they have not played in the past. One of those that are being experimented with across the United States is the investigation of cold crimes and employing civilians in that role. We certainly need to see more civilians playing a role in crime analysis and directing police officers in terms of where they ought to be performing their activities, whether it be investigations, whether it be hotspot patrol, or it be involved in problem-oriented policing. Some of the strategies that we know are some of the most effective that the police have. And the last thing that I will note that we need to see some serious reform for much of the other activity to take place is we need reform. We don't call them unions in Arizona, but we need to see some reform in terms of associations and the role that they have in terms of restrictions on how to deal with officers that we know are problematic within police agencies, as well as unions restricting management's ability to institute more effective responses to crime and to deal with issues of equality and policing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Doctor.
Thank you for having me here. I do appreciate it. And thanks for everybody being here. First of all, thank you for our men and women in blue. We do appreciate all the work that you do. When I was in the military, real briefly, it said, yeah, give a hand. When I was in the military, they said never volunteer for anything. Don't raise your hand. What I found out today is never walk in late. But I am happy to be here. I'm Walt Blackman, and I am a current state representative representing legislative District 6, which is the second largest district in the United States, and it's in the northeastern part of our state. And it's true, I am running for Congress. I think I fell and hit my head. However, with that being said, my present duties right now in the Arizona House is that I am the chairman of Judiciary. Last year, I was chairman of the Criminal Justice Reform Committee, and we concentrated a lot on the reforms that you were hearing earlier, and also the reforms, police reforms. And my colleague said it so correctly, is that my thoughts is that criminal justice, there are no political lines. Because Republicans get arrested too. And they're in prison and the same with everybody else. Criminal justice reform is a community issue that we need to look at. I wrote a bill last year, earned police credit. And what this bill particularly did, it allowed inmates to be able to reform themselves in prison and get the medical and the drug programs that they needed to be able to successfully get out of prison and contribute to their society. What a lot of people don't know, what that bill did was generated $480 million to Arizona, to the Arizona General Fund. That money, a portion was going to go to K through 12 funding, and the other portion was going to go to chiefs. So they could run their departments based on community output, resources, and the things that they needed to be able to make sure that they could reform on the ground where they know the problems are. Police officers spend 80 to 90% in our communities. So why not let them be the point of the spear when we're talking about reforming? So that's where some of that, that's where that money was going. So it would have been 800 million this year. Next year, it would have doubled, and then it would have kind of tapered out in the next 3 to 4 years. That would have funded education. That would have also funded police. Reform is not defunding the police. That is not reform. What that is, that's an accident waiting to happen. Thank you. Talk to those people in some of these high rate crime neighborhoods, and a lot of it, some of it is in minority neighborhoods. They will tell you that they want the police there. The law-abiding folks want the police there. And I don't think that that is just targeted to minority neighborhoods. I think that's in any neighborhood. I want the police driving around my community so they can do their job to protect and serve. So we have to be able to give them the resources to do that. Second part of reform is giving enhancements to police officers. Now, a lot of times, particularly today, to be a police officer, I'm not a police officer, to be a police officer is very challenging and tough because they are the target of everyone's stress of what's going on in the environment. And when we're talking about law enforcement, we're talking about civil recourse, what have you. The deal is that a lot of experienced police officers are leaving. And the pay parity, for example, our Department of Safety, our troopers, they are one of the lowest paid, not only in the state, but in the country. So we try to do pay parity with the law enforcement agency so they can recruit good people. Problem is that I don't think anybody wants to particularly go out and get beat up for actually enforcing the law that they are sworn to do. Police officers don't make the laws. I do. And other folks like me, we make the law. These guys and gals go out and enforce that law. So if I'm speeding, which I do a lot. Not on purpose.
And not in Chandler.
And not in Chandler. Just make sure I got to stay. You don't remember me? We sat next to each other. Yeah, I remember. If someone is speeding, it's not the police officer's fault that the person is speeding. What the police officer is doing is going up to enforce the law because you have put yourself and other people in danger. If I am robbing a bank, the same goes to that. We are punishing the wrong people. That's what we're doing. Now, police reform also requires being in a home. Your first experience as a child, well, for my kids, I have 5 kids, 4 boys and 1 girl, 2 adopted, so 7. Jeez. Wow. And the training that I give them is that your first experience with law enforcement, I don't want it to be a negative one. So you let law enforcement do their job. And if that person that is wearing the badge is acting inappropriately, then After you leave, then you go and make that complaint when you can do that. That is where you get your recourse. You don't get your recourse by saying, I'm not going to show my driver's license because it doesn't say it in the Constitution. Police officer has nothing to do with the Constitution. They have to do with enforcing the law. So we need to teach our children a certain manner of how to deal in situations. Now, there tends to be some profiling also. We know that. The data says that. It says that. I can say for a fact that I've probably been stopped more than anybody in this room. Really. My wife can attest to it also. However, I have not received one ticket. And it isn't because I'm a state legislator. This is long before I became a legislator. It was because my parents taught me about respect and dignity. And how you treat someone is how you're going to be treated. It doesn't work in all situations. But in my experience, the experience of my family and my children, if you act like a jackwagon, you might get treated like a jackwagon. Let them do their jobs. And then the conversation in most cases in the event will turn out pretty good. Doesn't mean you need to give me a ticket. Seems like you haven't yet. You haven't yet. Yeah, I won't be coming through Chandler anymore. You never worry about me. So reform is on a different types of level. It's in the home, it's in the schools, it's in the legislative body. It's how they do their job. But reform is not defunding the police or turning them into the problem. There are a few bad apples, just like there are a few bad apples in the legislature. I see them all the time. But I don't judge the whole member body because of one person's actions. Just like we should not judge every single police officer's actions because of one person committed a real crime of murder or some heinous act of acting inappropriately with someone. We cannot judge our police force on those single ones and twos. We have to judge it on how we make laws, how we teach those laws, and how we fund the folks that have to execute those laws. So, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Penzone, you have the final opportunity for a statement.
You give me on a short leash here. I can't go very far. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here today. Yeah, this one hot? Look at this. Karaoke. All right. This one's not working, but that's okay. Thank you for having me. Apparently you and my wife have something in common when it comes to driving habits, so that's nice to hear. She's not the only one breaking the laws out there that shouldn't be. You know, a lot's been covered already by these gentlemen on so many of the issues, so I don't want to be redundant, but I will tell you this. It's an honor to be in law enforcement for the context that if you truly believe in the values of serving people, there's no greater place to do that within that spectrum where you have men and women, especially when you're privileged like Chief Duggan and I, where we get a chance to speak on behalf of those who do the job. Those who truly, in the most difficult time in your life, when you or your loved one are in harm's way, they are willing to put themselves between you and that threat without even questioning it to ensure that you go home safely, even if it means that the cost of their lives. So for those men and women, whether it's military or firefighters or law enforcement, who make the difficult choice to be in public safety, it is our job to help them be successful as a community. Now, for those of us empowered to be, I'll say the gatekeepers of the office itself, the oath of office, our ethical baseline, which is a high standard, all those elements, our job is to be the gatekeepers to ensure that the wrong people aren't in the profession, misrepresenting those who do the job the right way. And that should be our ultimate focus is how do we, we hear police reform, and I don't know that I necessarily love the term, it's just semantics, but the truth of the matter is this, what is it that we expect from law enforcement? Because when I came into this career in 1988, the job duties and responsibilities were considerably different than they are today. And if we're unhappy with what we're seeing from law enforcement, then we have to ask ourselves first, what are the expectations? Because I think there's about 100 people in the room
And if I surveyed all of you, I'd probably get 150 opinions on what law enforcement is today, if they're doing a good job or a poor job, and what you expect of them every day. So that's not a fair baseline for us to start with, and we have to resolve that. But I want to share a story with you, if you don't mind. When I was a much younger man, which was obviously a long, long time ago. For those of you who laughed, please find your way out. I know some deputies here to escort you to your car. I had a friend of the family, a gentleman, well-educated. He happened to be a physician, and he asked me one day, he said, Paul, where does your power come from? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, in a free nation, every day you have the responsibility to go out there and potentially take the freedom of one of our community members, one of our citizens. That is the most powerful authority that you can have in a free nation. Where does it come from? In a naive way, I responded, I said, well, it's the Arizona Revised Statutes, it's the Constitution, it's all these things that give me my power. And he said, you're correct, but you're wrong. That is what defines the parameters of your power, but your power comes from the very people that you serve. So it could be the person that you're handcuffing and taking to jail, it could be the victim, it could be the representative, it could be any of the above, but they are all the ones who entrusted you to be the caretaker of this incredible privilege, not entitlement. Because when we put that badge on and that gun, it is not something that, I'm a superhero and the power is mine. It is, I act on behalf of those who empowered me to be a caretaker, a guardian of the order in our nation. And if you are not deserving of that privilege, those very people will take it from you. So respect them and respect it every day. And I don't know that it necessarily, obviously the story stuck with me, but I don't know that it really impacted me in the way that I have seen in the past 2 years. Because for those of us who think that because we put a uniform on and have forces of authority, that we can stop an overwhelming force of nature, that is a community uprising saying, we're not happy with you and we're going to protest in the streets. And whether you agree or disagree with how the protests were conducted, I don't think that you can disagree with the right of the First Amendment, the freedom of speech. So if you're unhappy, you express it and you do it in a lawful way. But that power was overwhelming. In some places, it forced change. In some places, it led to criminal behavior, which is unacceptable. But unequivocally, it told law enforcement, we expect more of you, and we expect you to be honest and transparent. So how do we get to that place in that space? And I don't think it's easy, but, and I'm probably going to offend you right now, so I'm going to tell you in advance, just, you're not Will Smith and I'm not Chris Rock, so don't be coming up here thinking you're going to when I tell you I'm going to offend you, it is law enforcement is not the issues in law enforcement are not a law enforcement problem. They are a reflection of societal issues. Okay, the men and women who put on uniforms don't come from some unknown place and suddenly they're empowered. They live next door to you, they go to church with you, their children go to school with your children. We are the community, okay? We are an extension thereof, not a division from. So when we look at the issues, the challenges that we have to ask ourselves, truly, what do we expect from law enforcement? And if those are our expectations, how do we prepare them to be successful in our world? How do we ensure that freedom and order have an equivalent balance? Because if you're familiar with the Constitution enough, you understand that those two words, in my opinion, are the most powerful. We are not a completely free nation. We have sacrificed freedom to some extent to ensure that there's order and safety, and law enforcement represents order. So when I hear the term about police reform, I would tell you, I do not believe it's police reform. I believe it is, let's look at policing in its current space and what we expect of it. And then if tomorrow I said, I want to train my employees to have a PhD in how to enforce the laws and to be a guardian of the community, what training is required, what oversight is appropriate, how do we during the course of their career ensure that we are providing them with the resources that they need to be not only successful, but well. How can you ask a law enforcement professional to go on calls for the next 5 to 10 years, seeing abused babies, seeing domestic violence, seeing atrocities, and not change? So at 1, at 3, at 5, at 10 years, we have a responsibility to ensure that we are bringing the members of the organization back and recalibrating where they are personally and professionally. Just last week, we lost a lieutenant who took his own life with 6 months left before retirement. I don't know why, and I may never know why. And I know that happens in society also. But if we want law enforcement that ensures the health, safety, and wellness of our community, we have to invest in the health, safety, and wellness of our employees. Yes. And then you will see just how we behave as a society. So these issues are just reflections, but I want to leave you with this before I close, and then we'll get to the questions and everything. But I am a believer that if we do a better job of addressing the issue of drug addiction, alcohol abuse, and all these other issues that are chemical in nature in our society, that change hearts and minds and souls of the people we love, if we have a greater focus on mental illness and understanding and how to address it, and if when it comes time to respond to those issues, that if our expectation is law enforcement is the tip of the spear, then we are definitely pointing the spear in the wrong direction. Right. We have to supplement it with care professionals who can address and help resolve those issues. If we want to see a reduction of recidivism, why don't we focus on ways to keep our young men primarily, and men of color, but young men and women out of jail the first time, so we don't have to worry about them going back a second time. Because right now, it costs all of you $350 the first day and about $160 a day every day thereafter to incarcerate people. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be strong on crime and punitive to those who have violated the law or victimized people. We absolutely must be a strong, safe nation. Yet, if we are investing that much money to incarcerate and about $80 per day to educate, aren't our scales off? Yep. So if we want to see change, thank you, keep clapping. What is your name? Come on up here, I'm going to deputize you. If we want to see law enforcement change, we should be looking at our children, our children's children, and say, do we have the commitment, the dedication, and the patience to rebuild law enforcement, fund it appropriately so that they can be successful, remove the responsibilities that don't belong in their space and give them to those most qualified, with the intentions that the next generation and the one thereafter live in a different world, in a different space, in a different place, because we're committed to it. But if we expect to do it in my term or the representative's term, or in the time that we're in this room, then we've already failed. So thank you guys so much for your patience.
So Chief, during the last several years, the law enforcement profession has experienced some of its greatest challenge. What do you believe is the greatest immediate future challenge for law enforcement, and what is your solution for that issue? Easy question. Easy question.
Well, the reality is there are many challenges to 21st century policing. In fact, we can spend literally all day talking about those. From, let's just say, for example, technology completely changing the nature of policing, but it's expensive, it's complicated, and it changes exponentially. So that is a challenge. But crime is a challenge. In addition to the crime that we've all experienced, the traditional crime of burglaries and assaults and thefts, there's a whole new array of crime that's challenging us every day. That's a web-based crime where our suspects could be anywhere in the world victimizing our citizens right here in Chandler. So the world is flat, and whether it's exploiting our children or committing some type of fraud or theft, that is a major challenge. And it's not a Chandler phenomenon. This is a regional, national, worldwide phenomenon. So crime is evolving and changing. But also, being in policing, this is my 36th year in policing. My father was a police officer in New York City in the 60s and 70s, and we often talk. I will say without any hesitation, policing has never been as violent of an occupation as it is today. Each year in our country, last year, over 55,000 police officers were assaulted, including 63 of our Chandler officers. There were 100 officers last year that were murdered, including one of our own, Chris Roar, that was murdered a year ago this month. So the dangers of this job have never been as evident as they are today. And then the other thing that's a challenge is the community's expectations, the absolute demand for transparency and accountability, which absolutely we all agree with, absolute a must, and immediacy, wanting to know everything right away. But the other challenge with the community expectation is the false expectation that your police officer is going to be a subject matter expert in every discipline. That's just not the case. And as the sheriff said, we are burdened with all types of responsibilities because of past failures of our society, whether it's the homelessness or mental health or drugs. We are the ones out there 24/7 awake. I say that because it differentiates us from the fire department. So challenges. And all of that adds up to what is the number one pressing challenge, I believe, right now in policing, and that's recruiting. So all the challenges I just lined up, coupled with what's happened over the past years, the demonization of policing, and not focusing on the virtues and the service and sacrifice why people go into this profession, and how these folks, every day they come to work, they make a difference. And oftentimes they change people's lives for the better. Amazing feeling. And that is not what's being discussed. That's being overlooked for a variety of different reasons. So how many people out there are willing to be police officer today? And of those people, how many people out there are talented and qualified to be a police officer today? The pool is small, and we're competing with every chief in this valley, every chief regionally, for that very, very tiny pool of candidates. So one of the things that we need to do, besides the obvious compensating our folks for doing a very difficult job, but we need to alleviate some of the pressures and the works, the alternate response. Right now, we are hit. So this is not going to happen overnight. This is a paradigm shift over maybe a generation, but there needs to be programs in place and alternate responses to take away some of the workload that our officers face every single day. And then the mindset of the vilifying police officers. We need to focus on the virtues of this profession and the people that come in and market it. So this is something that our youth aspire to be once again, because it's a dangerous time right now as far as public safety and our future. And I'm not just talking about today, but the next 3, 5 years, 10 years from now, who are filling the shoes of all of us when we retire. So, and when we leave. So that's a real legit concern, and that's the one that kind of keeps me up at night. So thank you.
So Dr. Katz, from an academic research perspective, what's the greatest challenge facing law enforcement in the immediate future?
Okay, thank you. I think that there are a lot of issues that we could go into. I think from an academic perspective, we could look at this in terms of effectiveness, equality, efficiency. But I think the one that people are going to struggle with the most is going to be issues revolving police discretion. The reason why I say that is with body-worn cameras coming into place, we all now are going to have a view into what is going on in policing that we've never had before. And we are going to see, as the chief pointed out, why some people may not be interested in being a police officer anymore. And we may have some initial reactions from the public about the distaste for why certain things take place on the streets the way that they do. But the fact of the matter is the police have an enormous amount of discretion for good reason. Police officers are generalists for the most part. They're not specialists. They have a very wide body or wide understanding of different issues, but it's not necessarily very thick because they have to deal with about every problem there is out there. And that means that it's a messy job. We know that when it comes down to a police officer encountering a misdemeanor, there's about a 30 to 40% chance they're going to make an arrest. Most of the time, they don't make an arrest, right? When they come into contact with a felony, particularly less serious felonies, there's about a 30 to 40% chance that they don't make an arrest. And they don't make an arrest for different reasons. It may be that the victim isn't interested in seeing the person prosecuted. It may be that they don't feel that the right type of evidence is there. But the public is going to start to see more and more of the amount of discretion and choices that the police make. And that is going to result in an enormous amount of Monday morning quarterbacking. There's going to be a lot of challenges to what is taking place, and there's going to be a lot of emotionality that takes place that I've even seen in this room. And the issue is that cops are human beings, and they are going to make mistakes. And part of an issue is how do we prevent mistakes from happening? But the other one is how do we respond to these mistakes in a reasonable way, right? In an appropriate way. as we start to move forward in the area of transparency, what we're going to start to see more and more with the data that comes out is the amount of racial discrimination that's taken place historically in policing. Let's just take, for instance, the issue of arrest. I don't want to say that we know, because I hate saying we know anything about anything. But what we think that we know is in similar situations, in similar communities, you hold all things constant, that African Americans are roughly 5 to 30% more likely to be arrested than white people, right? This isn't like a maybe, this isn't an emotion, it's not a feeling, it's just science, right? There's not a lot of intellectual honesty taking place about how do we solve those issues. And it's not as simple as saying, don't be discriminatory, right? I promise you that if you were to look at the exact same issues in the university, and I have my university colleagues over there, you will see discrimination taking place in terms of who doesn't make tenure. You will see discrimination in how students are being treated. It's not a police issue, and I don't want you to think that this is just an issue with how the police treat the public. This takes place in every fabric, every part of our lives. And I think dealing with issues of transparency and dealing with looking into the meat grinder of just everyday life of what it's like to be a cop and how they deal with issues is going to come back and be more problematic in a number of different ways. And a lot of how the police respond is it's going to come down to how we in the public handle ourselves and how responsible we can be in terms of saying, we understand that there's some issues, but that doesn't mean that we need to act rashly or harshly, but rather that we can think about these things rationally and that we can think about how to respond to some of these issues more holistically, rather than blaming one single officer or one single chief, but rather think about how we're going to deal with these problems incrementally over time to address the issues.
Thank you, Dr. Pence. So Penzone, I'm going to go to you next, because I'd like to get your perspective on what is the greatest future challenge and how do you fix it?
I don't like this question. I was going to say something else that I want to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about. It's pulling my leg to sheriff. Just no. I think that the greatest challenge that we face, and it's just one man's opinion, it's not law enforcement, it's not sheriff, it's just Paul Penzone speaking to in the third person, apparently. Why are we so divided? Why is it that you can walk into a room and say that person is of this particular color, therefore I feel a certain way? And, you know, we call it implicit bias, you can call it explicit bias. Why is it that person of that religion? Why is it that person of that political party? Suddenly I am already predetermined how I feel about them or who they are. And I'm not even willing to sit down at the table and have a thoughtful conversation to see where do we have common ground. And if we aren't aligned in a certain way, am I open-minded enough to learn, to determine if I can take in information, better understand their perspective, or maybe even apply it in a manner that we can work together. And I said with the utmost respect for the representative, because he's done an exceptional job, not only in moving efforts forward to promote law enforcement, but in addressing issues of efficiency in law enforcement when it comes to legislation. And I say that genuinely, although I think this is probably the first time I've really spent time around him, I am very familiar with his work. So I say this with respect to him. I remember visiting I was in DC one time and I went to the Capitol, and I had the chance to go out there on the floor when they were about to vote on something. And I looked up at I'll call the scoreboard, and I could tell you what the score was going to be before anybody cast a vote. I don't know, are we electing people to be sheep or shepherds when it comes to any position? Sheriff, representative, senator, name every political, every elected position. Are we choosing people to be leaders or followers? Because the job is to be a caretaker, I use that term, to everyone, to find a way to move our society forward, find a way to move the future forward for the next generation. And this is, again, it's derogatory, but I'm going to state it. I can go to a prison and look in the prison yard and see the factions where one individual won't go from their group that is safe to another area to speak with somebody else because that is survival in the prison. Why is it survival on the floor where votes are cast? Because the behavior is the same. So I think our greatest problem going forward is how do we overcome this feeling of safety that if I stay with people who are like-minded in a particular way or look like me or whatever it may be, that is the right space to be in. And if I go over here to someone else and try to learn from them or work with them, then suddenly I'm alienated from my own group and I'm out there on my own floating in the ocean. I like that. Thank you. The Lord is coming through me today. I hope maybe he's with me. I'm an old-fashioned Roman Catholic, so I always have my rosary with me. But I want to share this with you because we have Chief Solberg here and Chief Duggan, and some of you may remember last year, one of our representatives tried to move legislation forward that said every time law enforcement is involved in the use of deadly force and someone dies, that it must be investigated by a different agency, not the agency responsible. So the individual from that agency, you can't investigate your own. And some of us were very vocal in opposition, not to the philosophy, but to the legislation. And we faced criticism. But the reason we were in opposition is because we felt it came short. It fell considerably short of what you deserve, because we were all in agreement that it is best for transparency and accountability that we do not investigate our own employees in those circumstances. But the reason we felt it fell short was you can be involved in exact same shootings, use of deadly force, 2 officers or a deputy officer with 2 members of the community. One may pass and one may not. Why would you only investigate the case where the person passed if the use of deadly force is exactly the same? How do you have balance in that if you have an agency that just because of the mere population that they're caring for have a higher volume of deadly force incidents, and then you're asking another agency who doesn't have the bandwidth to suddenly investigate theirs, and that bigger agency has a smaller trade-off? How do you ensure that an agency that is extremely small in capacity has the resources to be at the table at all? So the reason I mentioned my colleagues is because after we opposed the legislation and it was held up and it didn't go forward, we faced criticism where people thought we were trying to avoid the problem. And our position was no, let us lead the way in solving the problem. Let us work together and prove that those in law enforcement leadership care about the community's needs. We met every 2 weeks for a year. And right now there's legislation going forward that says every use of deadly force by a law enforcement professional must be investigated by a different agency. The legislation says the state must fund a sustainable investigative unit that can work statewide to take those cases where those who are part of that unit have the highest level of training and expertise in those shootings. It says that we have a minimum standard of training that not only applies to that particular unit, but that there's going to be funding across the state for other agencies to improve their own skill set. It has a multitude of other elements that ensure that it is sustainable, that it's funded, that it meets the expectations of the community, and that it applies across the board evenly to all law enforcement agencies. It is at the last stage right now. It has gone through every stage. It just went through appropriations. I think it was 9-0, so it's got 1 vote left, and I'd be highly surprised if it doesn't get through. The reason I want to bring it to your attention is because when a question came out, what is my biggest concern? My biggest concern is that those most impacted and those most responsible don't find their way to the same table to have the conversation, and that we allow for, whether it is education or whether it's medicine or law enforcement or whatever it may be, that representatives who have great responsibility recognize the best pattern of practice is to first meet with those most impacted and those most responsible to get the feedback on the most sustainable way to put laws forward that serve the people. Because we have plenty of laws on the books, but not all of them really do the job that was intended. We have to be better at that, and we have to work together. So I guess I don't know what the question was or what my answer was. I'm up here just preaching.
I don't know. He sounded like he was talking to you. Maybe it's just me.
Well, it's a good thing I co-sponsored that bill. Let me give you your deal back. Huh? To my kid. So, all these answers are correct. And I would say that we need to look at, I like what the chief said about recruitment. Retention is an issue, and all chiefs and sheriffs are facing that, not only in Arizona, but across the country. How do we get to a place where we can keep good officers and recruit good officers? So I've written some legislation that speaks to that. I think if we take care of our officers, and we take care of their families, if they're happy at home, they're happy at work, we're gonna have better outcomes. We just are. because they're human, as the sheriff was saying. So one piece of legislation that I wrote was a police officer's education fund. So in the military, I spent any amount of time in the military after 190 days, 160 days, I'm entitled to a thing called a GI Bill. Now it's called post 9/11. And with post 9/11, many of you know that if I don't use that educational benefit, that I can pass that benefit on to my spouse or to my dependent, to my children. I have kids at the ASU that are using that benefit right now. The money from our release credit goes to this fund, to where if one of these officers, you're not an officer, you're a doctor, so he's different. I'm not saying bad, there's me as a doctor. One of these officers can't afford to send their kid to ASU because the pay is so low that they can pass this educational benefit on to their children, 36 months of an undergraduate degree. That is how we keep officers. Pay parity is also important. The chief said that they are competing in a very small pool of applicants with agencies across the state and the country. For example, I said, DPS, one of the lowest payest positions is a DPS officer. A DPS officer with 5 years experience gets paid less than a Texas Department of Public Safety trooper who is just coming out of the academy. That is some pay period that we need to fix as legislators. If a person is paid well, the recruitment, we're going to see it go up. We're going to see that the competition to be able to keep those people and to get those folks tested, to get good officers, we're going to see that increase also. And then also community involvement. Do we have the community involved in some of these law enforcement boards? I think that's important. I know some departments are doing that. But I think we need more of that, because as the sheriff said, they are the community. These folks are us. They're our neighbors. As you said, they go to church with us. Our kids are in school together. And then we need to make sure that smaller departments, like the department of Snowflake, for example, Snowflake, Arizona is a very small department. The pay is pretty low. And it's hard to keep people because they go to the sheriff's department, Navajo County Sheriff's, or they come down here to Chandler and get higher pay, which is nothing wrong with that. However, when that bill came out, the first bill that the sheriff was talking about, I thought it was ridiculous. Because I know that Snowflake and Holbrook and Show Low, those small communities could not afford to give up officers to come down to investigate a shooting at Phoenix PD. First of all, they don't have the training to do that. They don't have the resources. They don't have the personnel power. They don't have the funding to do that. So this new bill makes sense, but we have to do common sense steps. And then we need to make sure that the community understands our roles. And our roles are, as citizens, we want safe communities for our children to go to school in, go to church in, play in. And in order for us to have safe communities, we need to take care of the people who are keeping our communities safe. That's vital. And we have to get away from the divide. I like your point about the tribalism on the House floor. I've done a lot of criminal justice work in Arizona, and I have been crucified by my own party for doing criminal justice reform. I've been often told that you're a rhino because you want to look for ways to lower the cost of prison by using good criminal justice reform to keep people out of prison, send them to drug rehab programs, so on and so forth, diversionary programs. You're a rhino. So well, I guess if I want to pay lower taxes to a prison system, yeah, I guess I am. I want to keep our communities safe, then I guess I am. We're talking about drug treatment. Okay, we have fewer beds in our prisons, and please, as I digress, fewer folks in our prisons than we did last year because of some reforms in COVID. The prisons were closed, but drugs kept getting into prison. So we need to take a look at what we're doing there. Because these folks are getting back, they're going back and back, and then they come out and these folks are Facebook. We are expecting an officer when they stop a vehicle. You gotta imagine, when somebody gets stopped, usually that is the worst time in their life because they may be going through something. Okay? And I'm not saying if a person commits a crime, they shouldn't be held accountable. You get stopped, you may be going through something. We want an officer to be a mom, a dad, a judge, a jury, a psychologist, sociologist, a scientist, everything, and solve that person's problem in 15 minutes. But we're not giving them the resources to do that. We're not giving them the education to be able to do that. Body cams are a good step, but we need to do a lot more. If I want to keep my community safe, I need to make sure that I write the type of legislation that's going to do that regardless of party line. Did I answer the question?
Yes, you did.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
And you know, it's such a great conversation. We could go on and on and on and on the entire day, but we're just about out of time, unfortunately. But I want to come over here to the hills because I'm told that we have something called the Battle of the Badges coming up.
Hi, my name is Jim Hill. It's my wife, Cindy. We run Arizona LEOs, Arizona Law Enforcement Outreach and Support. It's an all-volunteer nonprofit. We don't get paid for doing this. We do specialize in community policing programs. Right now, our Battle of the Badges is a charity flag football game. We stick the flag because we all have jobs. It's first responder versus first responder. We don't do police versus fire anymore because we all have jobs and want to be able to show up. What we're doing is raising money for injured officers and fallen officers. And this year we're playing April 23rd. It's Maricopa County first responders versus Pinell County first responders. Sheriff Lamb came out last year and played, took his loss like a man and wants a rematch. He actually played. He was a defensive end. I was the center, so I got a few shots on the sheriff. But of the rematch again, April 23rd. It's at Poston Butte High School in Santan because Pinell County's the host this year. We're raising money for Tyler Moldovan from Phoenix Police Department. He was shot 8 times. No one ever thought he'd survive. He's getting some movement back. He's able to get off the ventilator 16 hours a day. So he's got a long road to go. The family of Officer Chewy Lara in Casa Grande PD, he died from duty-related COVID complications. And there's a Pinell County deputy who was just shot recently, and we're going to be helping him out. We also are funding 4 $250 scholarships for community college students that are in first responder fields. Again, it's a way for us to try to get those students to look at law enforcement in the first responder fields. So if you can help us out, you want to be a sponsor, you want to come to the game, we have all the information over at the table. Again, it's all volunteer. None of the money stays with the organization. It all goes right out to it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists. Let's give them a big round of applause. Further questions can be directed to the Chandler Chamber of Commerce, and the video recording from today will be housed on the Chamber website. Help me again thank our sponsors: Woodrow Technologies, Chandler Gilbert Community College, Arizona Valley Consulting, DW Consulting Group, Arizona Law Enforcement Outreach and Support, Attorneys for Freedom Law Firm, Legacy Lending USA, and Maduro Fine Cigars. You're going to receive a survey after this via email. Don't delete it. Don't do like me, okay? Don't delete it. Please take the time to respond to the survey. Let us know how you feel about this. Let us know how we can offer additional opportunities, learning opportunities for you in the future. Thank you so much for joining us. Go out and have a great rest of the day.